In the roll call, we've got a couple of members that aren't here yet. We'll hold the roll open for them. But go ahead and call the roll.
Senator Bouchard,
Here.
Senator French,
Here.
Senator Cost,
Here.
Senator Wasserburger,
Here.
Representative Blackburn, Representative Blackburn,
Here.
Representative Clausen,
Here.
Representative Fortner, Representative Porter, Representative Heiner,
Here.
Representative Larson,
Here.
Representative Western,
Here.
Representative Burke,
Here.
Representative Winter, Representative Winter,
Winter.
Chairman Donner,
Here.
Chairman Eklund,
Here.
Mr. Chair, we have four.
Thank you. We'll start out with a little bit of house cleaning. At the beginning of these interim meetings, we start with the rules. We have a standard set of rules that we've generally gone by. Hopefully everybody's looked through them. A portion of these rules we don't use, they've been in here for a while. If you were to go on your first page of these rules under meetings, A,
Try and grab, speak up,
supposed to pick me up.
but they can't.
Mr. Chairman, I can't hear you. I'm older and I don't.
Oh, doesn't, okay. So the portion of these rules that we have been in here as a standard part that we never use is on A, first page, A, under meetings, the last sentence. Notwithstanding any other provision of this subsection, less than a quorum of the joint interim committee may meet and transact business provided the absent members are subsequently polled and asked to vote by written ballot on any action taken, further provided the action taken at the meetings is hereby approved by the majority of the members of the full committee. We've never done it that way. We've never taken polls, never had absentee voting. So I guess I move that sentence be removed from it. And then the rules approved that rules for joint committee meetings be as they have been.
Second.
Okay, seconded. Ready, any discussion on that?
On the amendment?
On the, yeah, on the amendment. Remove that sentence. Any discussion on it? Okay, we're ready to vote. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Okay, any discussion on the rules that we have? Yes,
I'd like to make a motion
okay,
that any bill that we are sponsoring as a joint committee, that it should pass both houses separately.
okay. That has been moved. Is there a second? Seconded? Discussion on that,
Chairman,
Senator Boner?
on and against the amendment, ladies and gentlemen, I think that's important that we work as a team. There's been a lot of dysfunction between chambers and some committees. I just don't think that's necessary on this committee. We work together. Should be no division between the House and the Senate. I just don't think that's all that necessary. And, moving forward into the session, we've had times where a joint ag committee bill has gone to a different committee in one chamber or the other. So just because it doesn't pass one house in this committee does not necessarily mean that it's not going to become law. So I would resist that amendment.
Any further discussion? Yes, Senator Bouchard.
Mr. Chairman, I don't think it's about division. I think it's about, we spend a lot of time and we're outnumbered by the House already. And there's times where the House wants to do it and the Senate doesn't. And it's just about making a better working product and making sure that we can actually get a better product and a team working for the same goals. So I don't think it's about division. I think it's just about representing people better and making sure that we have a a good consensus between the House and the Senate and not spend a lot of time over an interim and then only have something that fails in the end.
Representative Ward.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, I guess I see it the same light. This isn't a division, it's just to stop us from wasting time. If we can't get it out of one house as a committee, it doesn't make any sense to say it's a joint committee bill if we know that there's not support in the House in that committee. And it has been said it can be assigned to a different committee. But if it's a joint ag bill, it's gonna go to the both houses. It'll go, and if we can't get it out of one house, it's a dead bill, so it's just a waste of time. But I think it's actually a good motion, and I would urge the body to support it.
Further discussion?
Mr. Chairman,
Yes.
just to point out that there was, I think, one animal cruelty bill that did not go to the House Ag Committee at all. So the idea that if it doesn't get support of one chamber within this committee or not, that it doesn't have a chance of passing isn't necessarily true. So I just want to make sure that we understand that. Once again, resist the amendment. Not that it's that big of a deal. I'm comfortable to do good work either way. Just want to point out that basic fact that happened just a couple months ago.
Representative Ward.
Mr. Chairman, I guess I just have a question. You know, I'm a freshman, but it doesn't make sense to me that we have a joint ag bill, but it's going to be assigned to a different committee. If it's a joint ag bill, won't it automatically be assigned to the ag committees? I mean,
No, it won't. It will be determined by leadership as to whether it'll go anywhere. It could be held up altogether.
and I think that's a problem. I actually think we need, and I don't want to preach to my chairs, but I think out of respect for our committee, we've done the work that should be in our committee. We shouldn't have our bills being heard by other committees. I think that's where we get into trouble when they start playing games and assigning our committee bills elsewhere, because it's not just us if they're doing that. So anyway, that's my piece.
Well, the bill that was in question was a bill that really needed to go through some attorneys. And eventually, in order to get it through the House, we had to do some rewriting. And we don't have any attorneys, I don't believe, on this committee. And that's the case a lot of times. Not necessarily good or bad, but we need attorneys in agriculture too. So there are some exceptions. I would agree with you most of the time. If we work a bill, it should be our bill. I have a little bit of experience. I think maybe a few others here have had we did do this once. We had on transportation. Here's my chair, or co-chair.
Mr. Chairman, could you speak up, please?
What's that?
Could you speak up?
I'm not loud enough. I'm not sure I like this mic system. I know we pick up on that, but the committee can't hear. We're gonna have to, and I'm not very loud, and I'll be hoarse if I do this all day. So in transportation, we did divide it out to where it had to pass both houses. And we ran into one problem one time, and that was when we didn't have a quorum of the Senate. And you only have 5 members, and that's part of the problem. As it was, we got through it just fine. I don't think it'll make a lot of difference. If we can't agree on something here, it's gonna end up being a waste of time. But I can't think of a time when we did work through the bills and pass both of them or fail both houses, except that one time when we didn't have a quorum. And that in my mind is what will kill a bill quicker than anything. If we have to, if we came to our last meeting and we have to have a quorum and we don't have it for whatever reason, the House doesn't have a problem. But like I said, you only have 5 Senate members and 3 of them are gone for a variety of reasons, then we're in trouble. So I believe we can work through this, the differences. This is an ag committee in the first place, and there's not that much division on things. Just like we're on health or education or something. Anyway, is there any more discussion?
Question.
Up, Senator Bouchard.
Mr. Chairman, I just want to say that we passed that last time in Ag Committee, and we worked through it. And so, I mean, if we're going to use one bill in question, I think we could just decide to get that bill in the other house, and I don't think it causes a problem. We did that same rule change last interim. So, I mean, I just don't see it's I think that, like I said, it's about making sure that we don't just get something through that the Senate maybe not going to agree with, and we do all this work on it. I think we should make sure we just agree on what we're working on, and that way we get a good product. So.
Question being called. All those in favor of the motion, say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed?
No.
Let's have it, raise a hand. All those in favor of the division of the votes between the Senate and the House? You understand the motion, everybody understands, okay. All those in favor, raise your hand. That passes, that was 8. Yep. All right. Okay, we'll do it. All right, that house cleaning deal out of the way. Okay, yes. Are any other amendments to the rules?
Question.
Question being called. I think we can do this with a voice vote. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Okay. Rules are passed as amended. 2 amendments. Yes. Yes, Coach Sherman.
Okay, yeah, just real quick to, first of all, welcome everybody. I know we got a lot of new members. This is your first interim meeting. So excited to get going here. As we alluded to, the microphone is in the TV. So just be aware of that, especially those in the audience. Apparently it's quite sensitive. So just be cognizant of that as you have your conversations. We're streaming live on YouTube. And so I agree, this is kind of a unique situation. We're used to having a microphone, but hey, that'll keep us focused and maybe not making unnecessary statements, right? If we have to conserve our voice and make sure that we use our diaphragm when we talk, I guess. So yeah, I just want to say that. I want to welcome everybody. Excited to be back in person, and make sure you enunciate and use your inside voice, but not your quiet inside voice as we have these discussions. So just a few, I guess that's my housekeeping, Mr. Chairman. I don't know if you have anything else.
I do, and I welcome everybody. I look forward to chairing this committee. I was on it a few terms ago and miss it greatly. This is my area of knowledge and expertise. I guess a couple things I'd say to the whole committee is if you're in doubt of any of the material we have, if you have questions on it, it's a good plan for everybody to research things ahead of time and have things ready. If you believe other people need to be brought into the process, we need to know ahead of time so we can notify them. Years ago, I always thought my ideas were best. And I went to some, they were actually called agriculture holistic management. And we went through exercises at those training sessions with committees. And almost invariably, 90-some% of the time, you always come up with a better product when you use the genius of the whole group. So everybody come with your ideas. We'll try to incorporate all of that into the bills. And I think we'll have a lot less trouble when we hit the floor and can't defend things. Try to be as quick and brief as you can, because as you'll see, we really roar through these committee meetings and study ahead of time. And that way we don't have quite as much to discuss at the meeting itself. So that's kind of my 2 cents on housekeeping. So we're going to start with authorities, quasi-governmental entities of Wyoming. And this would be the revenue bonding. We have Donna.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, we should.
Yeah. Are there any questions on what we're going to do on this next part, or any preference on how to move through it? Can you guys hear me down there? So, okay.
Good morning, Mr.
Welcome to the meeting,
Chairman.
Donna. You're on. You're still muted.
Oh, I unmuted on my end. Can you hear me?
Somebody has to turn the volume up. We hear you, but you're really faint.
Okay.
On
Sorry
ours.
about that. I'll try and speak up and get closer to my mic. Is that any better?
We got
It
it.
was on our end. You're good.
Okay, thank you. I prepared a PowerPoint to summarize the research memo that's in your meeting materials. So let me try and share my screen. Can everyone see the PowerPoint?
Yes.
Okay. So this PowerPoint, as I said, summarizes the research memo that you should have in your meeting materials that concerns industrial revenue bonds. And in order to make it easier to follow along with the PowerPoint and the memo, at the bottom of each slide, I've put the corresponding page number to the research memo. And excuse me, get my mouse to work here so I can hopefully go to the next slide. So what are industrial revenue bonds? Industrial revenue bonds, or IRBs, as they are known, are one type of municipal bond. Municipal bonds include revenue bonds and general obligation bonds. General obligation bonds are backed by the government issuer, and the issuer typically takes interest and principal payments, or makes interest and principal payments using revenue from taxes. Revenue bonds are backed by the revenues from the financed project. So revenue bonds can be used to fund either public benefit projects or private sector projects. When they fund private sector projects, they're known as private activity bonds. They're often used as an economic development tool. So industrial revenue bonds are a type of private activity bond. Private activity bonds can be taxable, meaning that bond interest is subject to federal income tax, or they can be tax exempt. Tax exempt bonds are attractive financing tools because they typically offer lower rates than conventional loans. But the caveat is they're tightly regulated by the federal government through the Internal Revenue Code, and only certain types of projects qualify for them. IRBs, or industrial revenue bonds, are often referred to as conduit bonds because the government entity issuing the bond acts as a conduit for the company to obtain financing. And this slide shows what a typical IRB transaction looks like. The government entity issues the bond, a bond investor purchases the bond, and then the government issue loans the bond proceeds to the company borrower to finance the project, and typically takes title to the facility being constructed. The company borrower then leases the facility from the government issuer, constructs and equips the facility, then purchases the facility for a nominal price at the end of the bond term. The company borrower is responsible for paying back bond principal and interest to the bond investor with revenues generated by the project. There are state and local tax benefits for the company borrower who is financed through an industrial revenue bond. Since the government issuer holds title to the project during the bond term, the facility is typically exempt from property taxes and may also be exempt from other taxes such as sales tax or corporate income tax. So this slide shows how the three parties in an IRB transaction benefit. So for the government issuer, an IRB is an economic development tool. For the company borrower, it provides financing for the project and may also provide state and local tax benefits. And for the bond investor, the bond provides investment income. And if it's a tax exempt bond, that income is exempt from federal income tax. So the Internal Revenue Code regulates tax exempt private activity bonds in two ways. They regulate the type of activity that can be financed, and those activities are known as qualified private activities. And the IRC regulates the volume of tax exempt bonds that can be issued. Each state is allocated an annual volume cap. Wyoming's cap is approximately $300 million. So those activities that tax exempt bonds can be used to finance include qualified small issue bonds, mortgage revenue bonds, qualified student loan bonds, and a whole list of other activities that you will find on page 4 of the research memo. Mortgage revenue bonds are what the Wyoming Community Development Association issues and uses part of Wyoming's volume cap for. Qualified small issue bonds can be used to finance manufacturing facilities if those facilities meet the Internal Revenue Code definition of a manufacturing facility. And there's some other restrictions. The maximum aggregate bond issue cannot exceed $10 million, and at least 95% of the bond net proceeds must be used to acquire, construct, or improve land or depreciable property. So what is...
Hang on a minute. We
Okay,
have a question.
sure.
Go ahead.
Yeah, just real quick, that $10 million cap, is that a federal requirement or is that something that we have control over at the state level?
That's a federal requirement.
Go ahead.
Yes, Mr. Chairman. So what is the definition of a manufacturing facility under the Internal Revenue Code? This slide shows that definition. It's any facility used in the manufacturing or production of tangible personal property, including the processing resulting in a change in the condition of such property. So I think the question the committee was interested in is, do meatpacking plants qualify for this type of bond financing? Do they qualify as manufacturing facilities? And I think they do. In my research, I came across an Internal Revenue Code training module that actually used a meatpacking plant as an example of a manufacturing facility. So I just want to pause for a minute. Up till now in the presentation, I've used a lot of terms to describe industrial revenue bonds. So just want to review those because it can get confusing, and you know, it may not be clear that when we use these different terms, we're still talking about IRBs. So IRBs are a type of municipal bond. They're a type of private activity bond. They are a conduit bond. They are a qualified small issue bond. And in Wyoming, we call them industrial development bonds.
The committee, do you have any questions at this point? So I've got one. We recently passed the bill on meat processing plants. In that bill, we had required a 50% match from whoever was doing it. Which of these in your form, your page just beforehand, which of those would we be able to fit in a municipal bond? And I'm thinking like a large meat processing plant, in which the person developing that idea only has half the money, and it could be several $1 million rather than, I think most things are $1 million that we've done thus far, but let's say we have a big one and they could still do it under the present meat packing, the meat processing plant, and it is 50% match. What best fits in these bond, different types of bonds? Because I see them as different types. I might be wrong on that.
Mr. Chairman, just to let you know, on this slide, all these terms that I've used are ways you can describe an industrial revenue bond. So, just to let you know, they're not necessarily different types of bonds. There are industrial revenue bonds fall under all these different types.
Okay, so there's a possibility in the bill that we passed that a person could use all of these types of, all of these revenue sources, is what I call them, I guess.
Yeah,
Right?
and Mr. Chairman, I don't know that I'm able to answer your question, but I could certainly look into that more. Is that a grant program that you're referring to, that the plant receiving the grant has to provide 50% of the funds as matching funds?
Yeah, it was.
Okay, I can certainly look into whether you could use revenue bond financing as a match. That is a question I'll try and answer.
Okay. We have more here.
Yeah,
Senator
sure.
Bonner.
And more of a, I guess, a statement that's, that's the opportunity we have with, making a bill if we want to provide some direction as to, if we're going to use this capacity we currently have already at the local level and, provide some sideboards. That could be one of them. If you want to use an industrial revenue bond to help finance a meat packing plant, for example, we can say, okay, you have to have a 50% match if you're going to issue it. So that's a point of, obviously this is has its roots in this revolving around the Wyoming Agriculture Authority. We recognize the concerns about growing government, so we're looking at ways we can use what we have to achieve basically the same goal here. So that's what we're talking about revenue bonds for. And so as you think of ideas for bill drafts committee, that's another way we can be doing it. Like I said, using stuff that's already on the board. Anyways, go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you, Senator. And I think I got some of my questions answered. That probably in our present system and our present bill, this is something we'd have to pass separate legislation to do. That's what I needed to know, I think. So if there's no further questions, go ahead, Donna.
All right, thank you, Mr. Chairman. So now let's talk about Wyoming and how Wyoming uses revenue bonds. Wyoming statutes provide a variety of state and local entities with revenue bonding authority. This slide lists state entities that have bonding authority. You can see the SLIB board is on the list, WCDA, the Wyoming Energy Authority, and some others. Local governments also have bonding authority to finance either municipal improvement projects such as sewer systems or parking facilities, or under the Wyoming Industrial Development Projects Act to issue industrial revenue bonds, which are called industrial development bonds under that act. And then we also give revenue bonding authority to Wyoming community colleges and to the university. So who decides how Wyoming uses its $300 million tax-exempt volume cap? Under Wyoming statute, the governor gets to decide. The latest governor's rules were issued in 2006. They allocate $90 million to WCDA, $30 million to the Wyoming Student Loan Corporation, and the remainder to a general allocation pool. State and local entities can apply to that general allocation pool for tax-exempt bond issues. I just want to note that, as many of you probably know, the Wyoming Student Loan Corporation was dissolved in 2016, so that allocation is going unused. So since the Wyoming Student Loan Corporation is no longer around, WCDA is about the only entity in the state that regularly utilizes the tax-exempt volume cap. The governor's office reported to me that they only rarely receive applications for that general allocation pool. So typically the entire pool is allocated to WCDA each year to finance mortgage revenue bonds and mortgage credit certificates. But most years, WCDA is only able to use about half of that $300 million allocation. Under Internal Revenue Code rules, states are given 3 years to use their volume cap allocation. So whatever WCDA isn't able to use within 3 years has been expiring. So typically half of Wyoming's $300 million allocation expires each year. So here, what I hope to be helpful takeaways from this presentation. Want you to know that either taxable or tax-exempt bonds can be used to finance industrial development projects, such as manufacturing facilities. Meatpacking plants appear to meet the Internal Revenue Code definition of a manufacturing facility and to qualify for tax-exempt qualified small issue bond financing under the state's volume cap. Wyoming is only utilizing about half of our tax-exempt volume cap each year. The other half is expiring as unused. So there appears to be capacity under the state's annual volume cap to issue tax-exempt qualified small issue bonds for manufacturing projects such as meatpacking facilities. And now I'll stand for questions.
Yes, thank you, Representative Clausen.
Mr. Chairman, Donna, so I have 2 questions. Is the SLIB board limited to the $10 million cap on the tax exempt? And then is there no limit on the tax or on the taxable municipal bonds? So
Right, the Internal Revenue Code, I'll answer your second question first, Mr. Chairman, Representative Clausen. The Internal Revenue Code does not regulate taxable revenue bonds. So to my knowledge, there's not a cap on those. Regarding the SLIB board, if the SLIB board is issuing one of these qualified qualified small issue bonds, they do have to abide by that $10 million cap. There are, all sorts of private activity bonds that you will see listed on page 4 of the memo. So tax exempt bonds can be used for all those different types of purposes. I'm afraid I am not a revenue bond expert. My knowledge is pretty much in that memo that you have. That's the limit of my knowledge. So I'm not familiar with the caps that may apply to other uses of tax exempt revenue bonds or private activity bonds. All I know is if you are using a qualified small issue bond to finance a manufacturing facility, then you do have a $10 million cap for that bond issue. So I hope that answers your question.
Representative Clausen.
a follow-up question, Mr. Chairman, Donna. So is it allowable through IRS code to have a $10 million tax exempt bond and then go behind it with a bond that's not tax exempt? So finance up to $10 million tax exempt and then go after that, and maybe someone else can answer that question. Go after the IRS.
I'm afraid I can't answer that, but I can try and get the answer to that question.
Representative Fortner.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Did I see at the front of your chart on this subject where it said Wyoming tax exempt, where Wyoming is the only state using this process? Is that true?
No, we're not the only state using this process. Other states utilize both taxable and tax exempt bonds to finance a lot of projects. And in fact, a lot of other states utilize these bonds more frequently than Wyoming does. I know in my research, I looked at New Mexico. New Mexico very actively markets bonds as an economic development tool to attract businesses to their state. So again, they use both taxable and tax exempt bonds.
Thank you. Representative Larson.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. You maybe discussed this already, but was there some constitutionality issues with these? And can you explain that? Or if you already did, I'm sorry.
Okay, Mr. Chairman, Representative Larson, are you asking about the Wyoming State Constitution and issues under the state constitution?
Correct.
I'm not aware of any constitutional issues. I do know that under the Wyoming Industrial Development Projects Act, that local government entities, so cities, towns, counties, and joint powers boards are given the authority to issue industrial revenue bonds to finance projects such as manufacturing facilities. So, I don't believe there are any constitutional issues there.
And Mr. Chair, we're just looking through our green books. It looks like they have been held constitutional in Reed versus Cheyenne. It was a 1967 case. So that's just reading the footnotes of the little green book there.
That's what I thought I saw. Hoping they would comment on that.
And as a reminder, WCDA has been using this for decades and has survived court challenges from, I think, 1978 was the last time. So yeah, it's because the government is just a conduit, as we discussed, there's no risk of public funds with these revenue bonds. And it's kind of interesting doing some research. A lot of the in Converse County, at least, we referenced the last time this was used was just last year. Converse County commissioners approved $10 million for a project, but it hasn't happened yet because they couldn't go out and find the financing. So they're still private, individual investing in it. We're just using it basically to avoid the federal taxes on it, which leads to a lower interest rate. So helps reduce the federal tax burden on these projects with the approval of local governments and the governor's office.
Further questions? So I did have a couple questions, I guess, about it. These, one of them is, has the state of Wyoming ever been held with a delinquent payment or a payment that can't be made under bonding, that this bonding authority was used, the money from the was used? Have we ever had anybody default in the past that has used this bonding authority?
Mr. Chairman, so in answering that question, I first want to qualify, and I didn't include this in the slide presentation, but this is in the memo that you have in your meeting materials. So Wyoming went through a period in the early 2000s where the state was investing in some of these revenue bonds by purchasing them. If you remember the slide way back, if I can get to it, where, well, I'm not sharing slides right now, but in a typical IRB transaction, the financing is provided by a bond investor who purchases the bond on the bond market. And so the government issuer, whether it's the SLIB board or whether it's Converse County, they're just a conduit. They are not responsible for paying back that bond. There's no risk to that government issuer. But back in the early 2000s, Wyoming passed a law that allowed the state treasurer to purchase some of these bonds as an investment. But we did run into some problems, and you'll see there's, as part of the memo, I talk about a couple of those bonds that the borrower did default on payments or has been late on payments. And so then in, I believe it was 2016, I'd have to look back at the memo, the legislature repealed that statute that allowed the state treasurer to purchase these bonds.
I apologize because I'm having a hard time wrapping my head around the whole thing. Most of us in business go to the bank and we get an operating loan or a real estate loan or whatever else. And it's just quite a bit different. You have to figure out a way of paying that money back. So let's go to those private investors that purchase the bonds. What happens if the project fails and what happens? Are they just out the money that they hope to
Mr. Chairman, that's my understanding, is that the investor just loses his money. Yes.
Right.
The government issuer doesn't have any liability in that instance.
Okay. Have we had any cases where investors were lost money in these issuance of bonds that you can think of?
Mr. Chairman, I'm not that aware of bonds that have been issued on the bond market. I don't have that knowledge. I will tell you though that in researching this memo, I did speak with the bond counsel, the law firm that advises the Wyoming Community Development Authority. And one of the points they made to me is if these industrial revenue bonds are going to be used to finance projects and sold on the bond market, the projects need to be credit worthy. Otherwise, a bond investor is not going to be interested. So, the project has to show that it's going to generate enough revenue that it's going to be able to pay back the bond principal and interest.
Right. That's really, that last little bit is really good information for me to understand that this will be researched well before we have anybody in the state losing money or otherwise losing money on projects that aren't worthy. Any further discussion? Okay. Thank you. If you can stick around, we may come back to you with other questions as we proceed through this.
All right, will do. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Okay, Wyoming Energy Authority. We have someone on deck for that. I guess I'd start by saying, does the committee have any questions to the Wyoming Energy Authority? That might be the better way.
He was there.
Oh, he's here.
Yeah.
All right.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman. Good morning, Mr. Chairman. This is Dr. Glenn Morrell. I'm the Executive Director at the Wyoming Energy Authority. First of all, thank you very much for inviting me to come in and talk about the Energy Authority and our bonding capabilities. Look forward to this conversation. If anybody has any follow-up questions after this meeting, please feel free to contact me directly. It's a complex issue, complex mechanism. I'm a simple geologist. I'm still learning every day about how these things work as well. It's quite a learning curve. Mr. Chairman, I will run through a real quick narrative. I did not provide any PowerPoint slides. It would have been the most uninspiring PowerPoint presentation ever seen. So I just decided to put some bullet points together, going over the history of the EA, some of our day-to-day activities, the capital resources we have, and the bonding authority that we have as well. So as many of the members of the committee be aware, the Energy Authority came about through the merger of two pre-existing authorities, the Infrastructure Authority and the Pipeline Authority. Came into existence on the 1st of July last year. And the objective of the merger was essentially to realize synergies and efficiencies and create a central voice for all things related to energy within the state. Similar to the agriculture industry, there are quite a few different government agencies in the state, all touching energy sector in some way, either directly or or indirectly, and the Energy Authority was created to essentially sit in the middle of it all and act as a coordinating hub for all those activities, and to assure that there was a coherent strategy and that all those agencies are all pulling on the same rope at the same time. So our mandate is very broad. We exist to secure and sustain the entire energy economy of Wyoming, which is enormous. It's the third largest state energy economy in the country. If it were a country, it'd be about similar to that of Norway. It's enormous. It's a full sector: coal, oil, gas, thermal, renewable, uranium, the full value chain, upstream, midstream, downstream, and everything in between. And the legislature also expanded that mandate to include all extractives in general. So trona, rare earth elements, bentonite, gold, silver, jade, it also falls under the Energy Authority nowadays as well. We're overseen by a 12-member board with 7 voting members and 5 ex officio members. We meet monthly and have an intervening email narrative and a quarterly review. They are very, very highly engaged individuals. Operationally, we have a small operating budget coming from the general fund appropriation, and we're supplemented in part by a federal grant in support of the state energy program. We run pretty operationally, and our general and administrative costs come in at around 55% of budget. In addition to that, moving on to day-to-day. Generally, our day-to-day is focused very much on project policy and economic development, all aligned with execution of our strategy. The energy strategy itself is a statutory obligation of the authority. We exist to administer, develop, and communicate and update the strategy. And then once we're at the same time, we're working on our own initiatives to advance that strategy, as well as collectively with our other agencies, as well as private partners as well. A good half of my day is spent on the phone with networking and trying to get people at the energy economy moving forward. In terms of capital resources, we have various pools. We administer various capital appropriations. For example, the legislature appropriated $10 million in the last budget session in support of carbon capture, utilization, and storage activities. The WEA was assigned that responsibility to identify the best way to deploy that capital. Money itself is held at the governor's office, and the oversight, the overall and the final ultimate say in whether a project gets financed comes under the Energy Resource Council, which is the supervisory board of the School of Energy Resources. In addition to that, we have the state energy program has various smaller pools of capital. For example, the petroleum violation escrow accounts. In total, they add up to about $5 million, and we have responsibility for those as well. The general appropriation capital, we use that under cost share framework to try and provide capital to cost share on capital projects. The SEP capital, we typically use that for contracted services, grants, and efficiency mandates and things like that. Moving on to the bonding authority, Donna Shippen did a great job of going through a lot of those basics. So I'm going to skip over a few of those and go straight to how they pertain to the Energy Authority itself. The pre-existing authorities, the Infrastructure Authority and the Pipeline Authority, had their own bonding authority, and it was merged and cleaned up somewhat when the Energy Authority came about. Excuse me. Currently, we have a cap of $3 billion. That was with a B, 3 billion. And we're allowed to deploy that in infrastructure and facility build out related to the energy sector in general. It's quite broad. We can essentially support any steel in the ground associated with energy development in general. And also when the legislature expanded our own mandate to include trona and rare earth elements, they also extended the ability for the bonding to be applied to trona and rare earth elements as well. They are industrial revenue bonds or pass-through revenue bonds or conduit bonds, as they were previously described. Which is useful, particularly in development of large energy infrastructure, because these bonds, it's preferred that they are deployed onto infrastructure that has a low commodity risk because they're backed by revenue, right? So if one were to consider an oil pipeline versus a collection of 10 oil wells, Those oil wells, the revenue coming from them is going to be considerably more volatile and variable because it's inherently connected to the price of oil. The pipeline, on the other hand, those contracts are typically very much on a tariff basis or a take or pay basis. So there's much less commodity risk. So consequently, your revenue risk is much lower in terms of repayment of the bond. So our preference is to pursue infrastructure projects that have have as little commodity risk as possible in order to lower our risk. The Energy Authority is set up in such a way that we can issue the bond and use the proceeds directly, which is a little bit of an exception to the example mentioned earlier. We can use our bonds directly ourselves if we wanted to build infrastructure and own it ourselves, which we are statutorily enabled to do so. We can do that. But typically, we would want to issue the bond and pass it on to a third party, the proceeds on. Currently, yes, the Treasurer's Office may invest monies into those. They can invest in those bonds. They don't have to. There's no obligation either way to the state. If the treasurer is not interested in the bonds, and we can just push it to the street and access it that way. Moving on to the last point here, Mr. Chairman, that I think is going to raise, there's probably going to be questions about this. How much has it been used? Well, these bonds, this authority has existed in various forms since the I think 2003 or 2004, in that time frame. And at that time since then, it's been used twice. The first one was an issue of about $36 million to establish a small transmission extension line extension. I think it was Basin Electric. It was issued in 2004, I believe, and just paid off just last year. And it was very much the classic sort of model where the Energy Authority or the Infrastructure Authority at the time issued the bond. I believe the treasurer invested in the bond, and the monies are handed on to the proceeds were handed over to the borrower, and the infrastructure was built, and we were simply passed through. The other example was by the Pipeline Authority, and it was a far more creative use of the bonding. They were trying to get a pipeline built to help out gas export infrastructure from out of the state, and with pipelines, there's frequently a chicken and the egg issue where the developer needs an anchor investor. They have to have that before they commit to building it. Typically, once they've made that commitment, then other contractors come in on top of that and build out the rest of the capital structure. What happened back, I think this was in the year around 2010 or so, was the Pipeline Authority stepped in and became the anchor investor on the pipeline. The builder, the constructor decided to go forward with it. Other investors came in and provided the rest of the structure, the capital structure, and the Pipeline Authority withdrew. So it was a very useful and creative way to get that piece of infrastructure built. Okay. So in short, next question will be, why has it not been used so much? Well, Mr. Chairman, you kind of mentioned it. Typically, a good project with good finance and good credit, at least historically, could get capital, particularly in the energy industry in Wyoming. There was not a massive hindrance to development of energy infrastructure with respect to capital availability. So a good project would just go out there and get commercial money. If they actually ended up knocking on the door of the Pipeline Authority, the Infrastructure Authority, the question was always asked, why are you here? If your project is so good, why are you coming to this place? Okay, but things have changed. And nowadays, it is not as simple as that. There are far more restrictions on capital, particularly in the energy industry, as we move through various changes that are going on global scale. Various projects nowadays just can't get capital, even if they are good projects. And so in the last year or so since I came on board, we have a couple of inquiries every month, and which is unprecedented. According to my predecessors, they would have a couple of inquiries every year. We get many of them. And in fact, there's another call just scheduled in a half hour or so with an investor and our bond counsel to explore possibilities as well. So that is an interesting development. And there are still many things to do. I think the Joint Minerals Committee, Joint Minerals and Economic Development Committee, has this issue also on their agenda to understand the bonding authority that we have and how to use it better. Personally, I think it's a question of expertise and marketing. I believe Mrs. Shippen mentioned that New Mexico markets their bonds for economic development. We don't. We're very, very passive about using our energy authority, bonding authority in a developmental fashion. And I think the easiest way to make progress in terms of using our bonding authority more proactively and with more utility is simply to have expertise in-house to actually promote it and market it usefully. This is a very, very powerful tool, and it needs a specialized expertise to maximize utility. Mr. Chairman, I will pause there and I open for questions.
Any questions? Representative Foster.
Mr. Chairman.
Yeah.
Mr. Merle, a couple of questions. So do you do tax exempt bonds? Or are you capable of doing tax exempt bonds? And would you be limited by that $10 million cap, or is that something that you simply do taxable bonds?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Clausen, I think we certainly can. But when you're trying to build a $3 billion pipeline, as you might imagine, that exemption or that cap is going to get exhausted very, very quickly. And also, Donna Shippen was correct. It is quite constrained. That aspect of the ability to access tax exemption and be qualified is very, very limited. I think in the energy world, the only real avenue to do it is if you're doing solid waste disposal. That is an exempt infrastructure. Mostly, it simply doesn't qualify. But we certainly can if it's there.
Oh, go ahead, Representative.
Mr. Merrill, another question. So I realized that the Pipeline Authority only ever did really one bond, and then the capital market stepped in. So simply by your existence, I guess the nature of the capital market, if they're giants, there's similarities between the oil business and the meat processing or the processing side of the livestock business, that if giants want to manipulate the capital market or mess around if they have huge market shares, simply by your existence, you guys can basically put an end, or just by having that option of your bonding authority, put it into some of the gamesmanship in the capital business. Is that kind of the general, I guess, duty of your bonding portion, or am I getting way out there?
Mr. Chairman, I believe if you were to frame that question as the bonding authority provides an alternative, then I'd say the answer is yes, correct. We provide a capital alternative that allows people who have the best intentions to facilitate a different avenue for a different channel for their capital and get things built.
Any further questions? Okay. Mr. Burrell. I believe I pronounced your name correctly.
Yes, sir.
Okay. All right. Next on our agenda, ready to move forward with the Wyoming Development Authority. There you are, sir.
I think there's a presentation in the packet. As with anything, sometimes when it first comes out, it wasn't a totally perfect type of thing. There were some inconsistencies in it, and I think some of that was brought about in some of the questioning earlier. Inconsistencies in the Wyoming Community Development Act as it was first done included, it said WCDA was both a political subdivision, and it also talked about a state agency in that act. It also authorized bonds for the WCDA without a vote of the people for a wide variety of loans for public and private facilities such as roads, sports arenas, airports, water facilities, subdivision development loans, and private business facilities. It also tacked on low-income housing loans were added onto that as an afterthought. The bonds were also indirectly secured by the mineral severance taxes collected by the state. Well, it's noted, not everything was perfect with that. And in 1978, State Treasurer Ed Witzenberger filed a lawsuit, Witzenberger versus the state, that talked about the unconstitutionality of the Wyoming Community Development Act. Based on that, they proposed uses of the bond proceeds. It said the proposed uses were unconstitutional due to the extensive private use, except for those loans that were to finance housing for lower income persons. It also said it was unconstitutional to use mineral severance tax monies or any other state or local tax money to secure the WCDA bonds without a vote of the people. Said WCDA could also not be a political subdivision, but could be a state agency, in which case the bonds would then have to be authorized by a vote of the people, or it could be an instrumentality of the state, akin to a nonprofit organization, but not a state agency. And then the state cannot be liable for WCDA bonds, and the bonds can only be payable from WCDA activities. Based on the lawsuit of Witzenberger versus the state, then in 1978, during the special budget session, Senate File Number 7, sponsored by Senator Dick Cedar at the time, introduced a bill that was passed and amended for the WCDA Act to strip all use of bond proceeds out of the WCDA Act, except to finance housing for lower income persons. It declared WCDA as an instrumentality of the state and not a state agency or political subdivision. It also stripped out any tax support, including the mineral severance tax reference for WCDA bonds. As part of that special session, then, if the state loaned $100,000 of federal CDBG funds to WCDA to cover startup costs, and WCDA repaid those loans within 2 years and has not received any other state funding, tax funding since that time. Bonding authority then in 1984, Senator Dick Cedar again introduced legislation to amend the WCDA Act one more time to permit the financing of economic development projects. That went on for about 4 years. And in 1988, Senator Jim Twyford introduced legislation to repeal the ability to finance economic development projects. The WCDA was permitted at that time to retain any loans that they had on their books, and they had to create a loan insurance fund to cover if those loans went bad at that time. And some of those loans, as I understand, that was before my time, but they were financed by economic development bonds that were issued. And in 2006, after I took over as CFO, the last of those economic development loans paid off in 2006. And we no longer have any of those loans outstanding as of this day. WCDA is run by a board of directors. There's 10 directors. 7 of those directors are appointed by the governor and with the advice and consent of the Senate. Their terms are staggered every 4 years, and they can serve 2 terms. And no more than 75% can be from the same political party. They receive compensation for each day that they perform their duties of the board. So there's 7 of those appointed by the governor. The governor is a member of our board and the state treasurer are a member of the board. And then I, as the executive director, am an ex officio member with no voting power. My position is appointed by the board of directors and serves at the place of the board. Now on to bonding authority. I think this is where a lot of those questions will come because WCDA, as Donna said, it uses most of the private activity volume cap that the state receives of approximately 300 million a year. And she talked about mortgage revenue bonds, and that's the bonds that WCDA issues. So we issue tax exempt bonds for the most part. Over time, we probably issued 3 or 4 bond issues that were taxable, and that was just because at that time there was a shortage of volume cap. Our small state minimum this year in 2021, the small state minimum for the private activity volume cap is actually 324,995,000. WCDA probably issues between 150 and 200 million of bonds each year to purchase mortgages from around the state. Those are allowed to be tax exempt bonds, but they are only for Wyoming residents. So each state has a housing finance authority, which WCDA serves as the housing finance authority for the state of Wyoming. So each state has their own. We issue the bonds and only purchase mortgages within the state of Wyoming.
We've got a question.
Yeah.
Percent cost.
Mr. Chairman, sir. So in some of the information, there was the ability from the federal government to shift some of the volume cap. Have we ever done that in Wyoming? Or is that something that's just never been necessary because we don't get close to the volume cap?
We, Chairman, Representative Placid, shifting of the volume cap, the 325 million of this year that comes to the state, WCDA is authorized to use 90 million of that, as Donna said earlier. And then others can apply for the portion that's not used by WCDA. I think she had there was 30 million that went to student loans. And then the remainder of the volume cap is in that general pool. And people can apply for that. Since I've been here, right before I came, I think there was a few requests for that. The Two Elks power plant was one of them that actually requested some of the volume cap in time. And since then, I'm not aware of any. There might be 1 or 2 projects that have put in. Haven't seen a whole lot of that. So after the calendar year expires, what happens is then the governor, if there's any unused volume cap, it flows to WCDA as the only user of the private activity volume cap so far. And we have up to 2 more years to use those funds. So we use the oldest volume cap first, and then we don't have enough production in the single family mortgages being a state of 550,000 people to provide first time home buyer loans to that tune of 325 million a year. So as she said, that will expire then after a 3-year period. What we've tried to do too is if that is expiring after the additional 2 years, we can actually convert that to mortgage credit certificates, which can be used with other types of loans, but more or less has to be a low income, moderate income type of thing. And then it goes away after that. But we're trying to use that as much as we can and when we can, but if it doesn't, it'll expire after that amount of time.
Lieutenant Wester.
Mr. Chairman, you said WCDA does about $150 million a year in mortgage-backed bonds. Did I hear that correctly?
Between 150 and 200 million a year.
Sure. And so who, I guess what outfit or what firm sells these bonds for you? Because they have to go into the capital markets. Buyers, whether they're institutional investors, asset managers, whoever they are, deem these to be a worthy investment by them. So who's the intermediary in that process?
Mr. Chair, Representative Wester, WCDA uses a rotating group of mortgage bankers. We work with Bank of America, Merrill Lynch. We work with RBC, Royal Bank of Canada is another one of the underwriters. And then we also work with Barclays, and we rotate them on a rotating basis. They actually help us to sell the bonds on the open market. We do it to both retail investors. It's open to retail investors and institutional investors. So when we go out to market, we have quantitative analysts that looks at our whole portfolio of bonds and determines the revenue streams that are coming in from the mortgage revenue bonds. Are the asset that backs it, that has to pay those bonds back, are those mortgages that we purchase with the proceeds of those bonds. And so we have to work with that person and a financial team to make sure that we're credit worthy. We go through both Moody's and Standard & Poor's to be rated on each of those bond issues each time. And then as those payments go in, we pay back the investors, whether they be the retail or institutional investors. So it's widespread. Both people within the state, and then a lot of big banking firms and insurance firms are the main institutional buyers of those bonds.
One question, go ahead. Mr. Chairman, thank you. So on average, how many residential mortgages are generated a year? And how many people go to their banks every single year in the state of Wyoming saying, I'd like to buy a house? And how many of those qualify for these WCD loans? Because obviously only a certain percentage is going to be lower income folks trying to buy a house. The rest, of course, will go through Fannie Mae or Freddie Mac or whoever. Because I'm just trying to think, is there demand that high for these lower income mortgages to fulfill that $150 million? Because that just seems like a really big number of Wyoming originated low income loan applications.
And Mr. Chair, Representative Western, it will vary because some years we've had purchases of 900 loans, and some years we've had over 2,000 loans that WCD actually purchases and provides with first-time homebuyer mortgages. Those also, that 150 million that we issue may be a refunding of prior bonds that were outstanding that were at higher interest rate levels. So we've refinanced those to bring those bonds down and pay them off. So that may be paying off some of the old bonds that WCDE had and capturing lower interest rates. All the bond issues work too. The bond issues are within a trust indenture. So the revenues of any bond, the mortgages cover any of the bonds that we've issued under that trust. So we can buy down the rates by issuing lower rate bonds at current rates and paying off the older bonds. So that 150 million currently on the books, WCDA services a majority of the mortgages that we do ourselves, and we have about 15,000 loans that we service within the state. In the demographic that we're in for the income levels, it's 100% of area medium income and below that we can service with that. And we have at the current time about 24% of the market where WCDA gets those loans for people that would qualify for it.
Thank you. Just make sure these loans go, or these mortgage-backed securities get sold to said retail or institutional investors. Do any of them end up on the books of Fannie Mae or Freddie Mac?
Mr. Chairman, Representative, we have 3 different types of mortgage products. We'll do the bond loans that are these that we're talking about here. We'll also do secondary market loans. Our Advantage product that we call our Advantage product are loans that are sold and then they're put into an actual mortgage-backed security that is guaranteed by Ginnie Mae. So they're a Ginnie Mae mortgage-backed security. They're sold to investors, some generally larger banks for those investors. And so that's a mortgage-backed security. And then we do a Fannie Mae. We also do Fannie Mae loans that we do directly and sell directly to Fannie Mae, and those go to Fannie Mae. that out of our entire portfolio, the Ginnie and Fannie, the secondary, the GSE products are probably about a quarter to a third of our volume are those. But then the bond loans are our biggest volume. Because they're issued with tax exempt, and so they're at lower rates.
Representative Portner.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Are your loans competitive interest-wise with local banks or banks around the state? Or how do you guys high, lower? You're out, and you're for low income, it sounds like a disadvantage. Are your interest rates substantially lower, or are they just about competitive with the banks in the state?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Portner, generally we try to stay very competitive with them. Right now, we're probably at about 25 basis points or a %, higher because we have issued the tax exempt bonds, so we have an interest rate that we have to pay back, and we have to make, at that same time remain competitive with the local banks. But we don't want to force the local banks out of it either. The way that the bond loans are originated, a person goes to their local bank, signs up for a WCDA loan because that is for first-time home buyers, sometimes lower income. Sometimes they can qualify at lower credit scores. It's whoever insures that loan, whatever the credit scores they require, because those loans are backed by FHA, VA, and RD, generally the government backing. So they have minimum credit scores that are required. So sometimes they qualify as a first-time home buyer and with lower credit scores because that's who guarantees those. So we're able to do those. But we, at the point of it, at some of the high point when bond interest rates were extremely low, we're probably 0.5% to 1% lower than what the local banks would do it at. So now we're about a quarter higher just because of bond interest rates. But we try to remain very, very much on top of that.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Mr. Chairman, is there, so you're primarily low income or real estate. Did you sell that on the bond market? Is there an avenue that you know of without going directly to the capital market? If somebody had like say a 10, 50, 100 million, 200 million dollar project, is there an avenue similar to yours for someone to go through and do that that's not energy related, like the energy pool? That could be outside.
Yeah, Chairman, Representative Plus, there are sometimes we have done direct sales to industry. I mean, some of the banks will come in and buy a portion of those and do direct placements. A lot of some of the rental projects that happen around the state, the multi-family type of rental project, will have somebody that buys their bonds directly. An investor that they've worked with that wants to buy those types of bonds or that looks at those bonds and sometimes does it for a better rate than you can get on the open market because they know it directly. Kind of depends on, I mean, if it is meat packing or whatever, I don't know for sure in that realm of it, but there are private investors that purchase those types of bonds.
But you're unaware of like an agency like WCDA that would handle it become a hey, maybe this is I've got to ask you.
Yeah, Chairman, Representative Plus, I'm not sure of an agency that does that.
Representative Ward.
Yeah, I had a question. How has the pandemic impacted the WCDA?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Worf, let me tell you, in March of last year, I came back from a legislative conference in DC, and the next day we were supposed to price bonds. And it was shortly it was right at the beginning of that. We were not able to sell our bonds that day. They went on the open market. We had orders of probably over $30 to $40 million worth of orders. And throughout the day, a lot of those investors pulled their orders. And so we did not complete a bond sale on that day. We went back into the market towards the end of April after things kind of settled down, able to successfully sell our bonds at good rates. But it was just the timing. And anything with the market. A lot of time is timing, and that was just didn't happen to be the right day. And we just pulled our bond deal at that time, but we're able to complete it a little over a month later. And then throughout, we've had 2 more issues since then. So it's been really the municipal market, and some of the questions came up with the ability to make those payments and that. And WCDA has never missed a payment on their bonds throughout the time. And like I said, WCDA is the major issue of the private activity volume cap in the state. And I'm not aware of any projects that of municipal governments and that have had problems with that in Wyoming. I mean, the big ones nationally was Orange County and some of those, back several years ago, but yeah.
Any further questions, committee? Thank you, sir.
And then, yeah, I'll finish up here. And I think Donna did a good thing on talking about the qualified projects that you can use the private activity volume cap for. And like I said, all of our bonds then are secured solely by the mortgages that we purchased with the proceeds of those bonds. And as of June 30th, end of our last fiscal year, WCDA had bonds outstanding of 867 million. And then our mortgage portfolio was over 908 million of mortgages on our books. Other information, WCDA also, other than the low income or low to moderate income single family mortgages, we offer programs to gain home ownership. We have a down payment assistance program and also a home buyer education program and counseling. We provide counseling through the Wyoming Housing Network, and then partnerships with developers that we work with other nonprofit and for-profit organizations to do housing finance. We also have federal programs that we administer. We administer the Low Income Housing Tax Credit Program, the National Housing Trust Fund Program, the Home Investment Partnership Program, and now as of July 1st, we'll be taking over the Community Development Block Grant Program for the state of Wyoming. We operate with 45 employees and we're based out of Casper. And when WCDA was set up, where they also are part of it. They're an instrumentality, but we participate in the state retirement programs and the employee group insurance programs. All I have. Any more questions?
Okay, thank you.
All right, thank you.
Next, we have the Wyoming Business Council. If you need an extra chair, just pull one up. Start with introductions. Jill, you first.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. I'm Jill Tredemba, the Agribusiness Manager for the Wyoming Business Council.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. I'm Josh Durrell, I'm the CEO of the Business Council.
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, I'm Ron Goldberg, Strategic Partnerships Director for the Business Council. Thank you.
Well, proceed with your presentation as however you're going to do it.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I believe there is a presentation that if possible to present, that's fine, but I believe you also all have copies of that. We'll do our best to get high level and brief and do a bit of an overview of our agency as it stands today, and then maybe address a few of the things that have been brought up to this point with others that have testified. Well, to start with, the Business Council was established in 1998. And so for the last 23 years or so, we've been working to develop resilience in the communities in Wyoming. And ultimately, our goal is not to create a diverse economy. Our goal is to create a resilient economy. And we say diverse a lot, But ultimately, we really want to create a resilient economy. And that's one that can weather the storms of the ups and downs that industries have and ensure that our communities throughout the state are not as impacted when they're so dependent upon one industry. We do that through various services and funding mechanisms and policy development. But ultimately, we do that through the state's economic development strategy. And so in this next slide, you'll see our one-page strategy. The intent of this strategy was really to operationalize or make practical a lot of the vision that has been presented in previous years. We want to really add value to what makes Wyoming a great place and the foundation that our economy is based upon. And so if you think about it, we want to be able to add value and develop programs that add value to the natural resources that we have through extraction and energy. We also want to be able to add value to tourism and, of course, agriculture, what we call the big three in our economy in the state. We want to do that by leveraging and we want to activate new sectors because, again, we realize that to develop that resilience that we need, we have to be able to stand upon the shoulders of giants, and those three industries are giants in our state. And so to activate new things, now whether that means expanding the value chain of those, finding new ways to extract value from our natural resources or agriculture or tourism, or bring in new economic sectors into the state, we want to be able to do that. One of the things that I think is important about our strategy is we're looking at it as an and strategy, not an or. I think a lot of times people think, well, to do something new, we've got to give up something that we've had before. And that's not at all what we want to accomplish. We want to be able to accomplish an and strategy so that as industries ebb and flow and boom and bust, if you will, that we can provide the support and really a steady economy for those communities in which our citizens live. So that adding value in order to activate new sectors works together and should continue to work together. We do that with 35 employees. We have 35 employees, and if you jump to the next slide, you'll see our services division. We have organized ourselves in a way that allows us to think about what are the various things that communities and businesses across the state need. And so in our services division, we have a number of experts. Now, we don't have 10 different people in agriculture, for example. We have one, but she works to activate and work closely with partners across the state in order to get as much done as possible. I think that's a really key thing to think about with the Business Council, is that we don't have teams of people doing one particular thing. We have individuals doing particular things, and they activate others around the state, and they utilize that collaboration in order to get their work done. So for instance, you'll see of these 9 folks that you see here, we don't really have deep teams of people doing the work on the ground. We work to set that policy, deliver funding, and provide leadership so that economic developers around the state, chambers of commerce around the state, different agencies within the state are able to help us accomplish our goal. And so with that too, you'll notice on the next slide, we have 6 regional directors. We've divided the state into 6 regions, and we can serve those various areas of the state with our regional directors. You'll notice that 2 of those positions are currently open, and we are looking to hire new folks in those regions. That regional touch or feel is really important to us. We want to be out in the state. We want to understand what's interesting and different about the local economies, and we want to be able to be a conduit of that information back through to committees like this one, as well as our team in Cheyenne, to be able to do as much as possible. So this is a bit of a plug, but if you know someone in those areas that might be a great fit for the Business Council, please let us know. We're looking for someone in the southwest region of the state as well as the northwest. So thanks for that. If you happen to know somebody who's great and wants to make a difference in Wyoming. We also have an investments team, and at one point we were really sort of divided into community development and business development. And what we realized is that we really have a number of investment tools, and we'll talk about them here in a moment, a number of investment tools that are available to communities and to joint powers boards, communities, economic developers around the state in order to develop their economy and really make things happen. We'll talk more about those specifically, but we wanted our teams to not look at, are we doing business development or community development, but really rather, what are the investment tools that communities need and how do we leverage them so that they're able to really grow their own unique economies. I think if you think about the 99 municipalities in Wyoming, they'll definitely tell you there's at least 99 unique places and everybody's different. However, we want to be able to say what is interesting and unique about those different places and how do we help them with our investments basket, if you will. Of course, it requires a bit of operation. It requires people to get a few things done. So we have our operations team and our strategy team. Now, our strategy team is relatively new in a lot of ways. Many of you know Ron Goldberg up here today. He's someone who works closely with a number of our partners, not just legislatively, but also in organizations around the state in order to really help us spread that strategy. Because we know that the state's economic development strategy is not going to be done by 35 people. It's going to be done by, nearly 600,000 folks, really, and that's what it's going to take. And so that strategy team has changed and grown over the last year for sure. We've added a communications area as well as someone who's really about innovation and trying to develop programs that make the most sense in the communities that we have. In a moment, I'm going to talk more about the programs that we have, but before we do that, I'm going to turn it over to Jill Trivimba to talk a little bit about our agribusiness and what we've been doing there. Jill?
So you can see on the screen there my contact information. Please jot it down. I'm happy to answer questions, offline anytime if they come up. On the next slide, I just wanted to give you a little idea of some of the things we've been working on in the last year. It's by no means this is what Jill does. It's really more of an overview of some of the highlights that got done. It happened within our state, even as we were really focused on COVID relief in the last year. The Business Council definitely had a big piece to play in that. And so while that was happening, with some collaboration through the governor's office and of course the Department of Ag, that there was meat processing money that went out, and the state is now sitting with 9 USDA plants. So I think we can all see that as a win. We've got some recruitment going on. That's also an advantage of the Business Council is Ag gets to take advantage of the recruitment manager on our team. And so together we worked and recruited an ag tech company. And again, that's just one example of the companies that are coming in. The work continues overseas with the International Trade Office, and had to get a little creative on getting samples to Taiwan and virtual trade shows, but some Wyoming companies were still able to make that happen and get their goods shipped overseas. Local food through the pandemic, as you all know, continued to grow and become a big focus, not only in our communities, our state, but nationally as well. And people really began to value that. And we're trying to capitalize on that and really take advantage of the momentum. And by leveraging our partners around the state and building those networks, we're seeing some movement on that. So that's been really exciting. You all know the money that went out the door in the Ag Relief Fund. That $35.1 million is part of the money that went to ag businesses. Through the other BRP programs, there was money that went to those producers. We just didn't filter the data that way. So I have some numbers that I've processed through just looking at names of companies, but we don't have hard data to give you on that. But we do know a bunch of money went out the door through those other programs, as well as the meat processing grant that I mentioned earlier. And then we continue to work with UW and actually the community colleges too on workforce and blockchain. And again, just really trying to open markets, help people scale up and put money back in producers' pockets.
Could Could you hold up? We have a question. Senator Bouchard.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So there were a lot of audits that went out. And so what I heard was there was money that went outside of the country. I mean, people used the business maybe that they listed here but they weren't really here. Were you able to retrieve any of that money back that went out of the country? Doing these audits and.
Go ahead.
Mr. Chairman and Senator Bouchard, great question on the audits. That's a critical piece. I mean, one of the things that, when we undertook these programs, one of the things that the legislature asked us to do was act quickly. And so we did have to balance that acting quickly with doing the right thing and making sure that that money was for Wyoming businesses. We did run into cases that we stopped, many different cases that we actually stopped before funding, that where entities maybe had a company listed here, but they were not a Wyoming entity, truly a Wyoming entity with a Wyoming address, and maybe had gone through, maybe a business, kind of like a broker almost, or some sort of entity here. What we did is stopped many beforehand, and then in our audits, we have been working closely to gather that money back. We have received a lot of money back in those audits. There is still some money outstanding. We did provide a letter to the Joint Appropriations Committee, and I believe the LSO, on a more detailed version of all of those audits. And I'd be happy to answer any specific questions either offline or in that way. But yes, we did go out and retrieve a lot of that money. We are working also with various entities, law enforcement entities, as well as county attorneys and folks like that to go and get that money as well. That's a big challenge, no doubt about it. And it was something that was important for us, not just because we wanted that money to be retrieved and reutilized in other programs, as you're seeing now. Some of that money that was left over from the CARES money is now being reutilized through the end of this year, but also because we know that the U.S. Treasury will likely come and audit those programs and make sure that we're doing the right thing as well. So great question, and thanks for asking.
Well,
Go ahead, Barry.
so could we have, Mr. Chairman, could we have a report on that so we know how much money we're talking about that we didn't retrieve, how much we are retrieving? Maybe the whole committee can see it.
Mr. Chairman, yes, I'll absolutely make sure that letter, if you have not received it, that we will provide that report to you as well.
Okay, we got more questions down there. Representative Larson, we'll start with you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Are the monies that went out, are they on Open the Books and people can find them? And if so, I'm sure you're getting responses when people do look.
Mr. Chairman, yes, Representative Larson, we are, those are on wyopen.gov, I believe it is, wyopen.gov. Those are available there, and then we have received a number of information requests, public records requests, and we provided information back to those folks who have requested.
Representative Fortner.
Thank you, Chairman. How much of this 35 million you guys used last year, how much of that stimulus money? Does that, any of that come from the federal government, or all that come from the federal government?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Fortner, all of that money mentioned in that $35.1 million is from the CARES Act. So it was all really from the CARES Act.
Mr. Chairman, follow up, go ahead.
How dependent are you guys from here on out going to be on the federal government for your small business program?
Mr. Chairman, that is an excellent segue, Representative Porter, into the next slide. If you don't mind, I'll talk a little bit about it, and we can talk about it there. Oh, we still have a few more. So the answer is we will utilize the American Rescue Plan and other federal funds as appropriate and to do our work. We feel that that's a funding mechanism that could be very useful to stimulate the economies of Wyoming, and we're going to utilize them as we can.
Go ahead.
Okay, well, I guess we'll shift a little bit from the kind of one-time CARES Act funds to the ongoing programs, and really the trend over the past Well, 25 years, I guess, since the Business Council has been in existence, and I guess we can hit on this in the next subject later this morning, but I guess at this point, I have some concerns about the trend and the way that the Business Council is supporting agriculture, and you go through the history. Part of the information, frankly, we asked for is, and I appreciate what you said, how maybe it's not going to be as distinct where you have, 4 or 5 people only for agriculture, and you have now one employee dedicated to agriculture. That's better than the 0 that was before. I appreciate the improvement, but I guess I'm still concerned if you go back at the history where the Department of Agriculture in the 90s had 4 to 5 employees, from what I understand, that were dedicated towards ag business development. They got shifted to the Business Council, and I think even as recent as 5 years ago, there's still that agribusiness division,
Yes.
which was eviscerated over the past 5 to 4 year times, certainly before really 8 year times. So I'm not laying blame, as your being. In fact, I appreciate the effort, but I'm still concerned about the trend. And so I guess if you look at, like I said, leaving aside the one-time stuff, CARES Act. So for example, with the USDA meat processing plant, that's been great. It's also been a result of the happenings in the private sector due to the pandemic. So what role has the Business Council played in increasing those number of plants from USDA to 1 to 9? Have you given, and just in general, have you given any business-ready community loans to ag businesses? If so, that'd be all good information to have perhaps for our next meeting. Actual dollar figures, how much of those loans and the things that the Business Council does have gone to ag-related businesses versus everything else. So that just to share my concern right off the bat, if you have a chance to answer it, that'd be great right now, but certainly it'll be ongoing discussion. So.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman and Senator Boner, I'm going to let Jill talk a little bit about the processing plants and some of that and what we've done there. But I also want to address the sort of the fact that I think we went from 6 folks in the agribusiness division to 1 person. And while I do agree that Mr. Gimba is superhuman, I don't think he's 6 people, right? So that has been a challenge. It's not just been a challenge within for agriculture, but for all of them. You'll also notice that there are exactly 0 people on the services team that deal with energy. That too is a bit of a challenge, right? And you'll also notice no one there for tourism. So it is a challenge indeed. And I'm sure that'll bring up some other questions, but I think what we realize is that we are going to have to do more with less. And it's not just in people, it's also in funding. Right, I think our BRC budget has continually been reduced over the years, so which limits some of that. And as Representative Fortner asked about, I believe it was, about more funding programs, we're trying to figure out ways to leverage our folks like Jill to really help the local communities and local associations do more on the ground, because we realize we can't do that. I wish I knew a little bit more about the agribusiness division and what was super effective and what wasn't, so that we could take that. I just frankly don't know the answer to that.
And so, Mr. Chairman, I'm not necessarily looking at the number of employees you have that are dedicated to agriculture. I'm looking to get that on the ground.
Yeah.
And like I said, any concrete numbers would be great. I just point out that the energy industry has the energy authority. Tourism. Our travel industry has Office of Tourism. That's part of the discussion here, and that's kind of idea with the agriculture authorities. There's no actual agency dedicated to supporting agriculture, and that's my concern here. We'll get into it a little bit later in the afternoon or in the morning. But we've kind of distributed all the support for agriculture over 3 or 4 different agencies, and so that's what I'm concerned about. Hopefully it's something we can take steps towards addressing here without growing government. But yeah, absolutely. Yeah, no, that's what we're here to discuss. So, so like I said, one idea was the Ag Authority. Just to be clear, committee, I understand we're probably not going to move forward with that, but we're just looking for other ways to achieve similar goals, and that's what we're talking about here today. So, anyways, I'm still concerned. I like to see the dollar figures as to the effect on the ground. How many grants have you given towards ag-related businesses? How's that compare over the past couple of years? But yeah, we're going to continue to have that discussion. So anyways, I appreciate the work that you 3 individuals sitting here today have done. I do appreciate that. So.
Yeah, for now, Mr. Chairman and Senator Bonner, thank you. We'll be happy to dig up those statistics on, what has been applied for, what has been funded, what kinds of projects that have made that difference. And then I'll let Jill address the question about the 9 processing plants and that growth that you prefer.
Question I probably, so we're gonna have a new round of funding. The Wyoming Business Council will be involved in that. And I'm not sure anybody can answer this, but I'm curious. We're researching how the money can be spent and utilized. We're hoping that we can expand some businesses and help some people in Wyoming. If along the way you're able to answer any of the questions I have, because I don't think it's going to be the same as CARES, is what I'm understanding. There's a whole different set of rules. They're not as strict. The CARES funding was really confusing because it seemed like the money was to be designated for those businesses hurt the most. And some of those businesses were restaurants and hospitality industry, and to pay the money back. And for whatever reason, they needed the money to survive through the COVID shutdown, and then had to pay it back. Anyway, that's what I understood of the whole thing. I'd like to know how this new round of funding will affect the Business Council. If you're able to fit that into it. And then the other part, our vision is greater than meat processing plants. We're hoping that within agriculture, we can add value to other things, possibly flour mills, possibly necessary elevators or transportation systems that get our product moved around. So it won't be just meat processing plants. It sounds like that's all we're working on, but it isn't. I'd like to see agriculture and well beyond that. We're good? Go ahead, Jill.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, I'll address the meat processing issue first. The way we are involved with that and support that is, in my role, I get a lot of phone calls from prospective business people wanting to know how to even get it going. And so I mentioned earlier, just some other folks, at the end of October, I had received 52 calls last year, and I started late March from Wyoming people, individuals wanting to get into processing. So if you kind of look at my role as a bit of a consultant in that way, I help them connect the dots of whether it be the regulatory side, financing, USDA, to really help get their business off the ground with a solid business plan so they can be successful. And through all those people, some of them happen to fall into that perfectly, that they could utilize the efforts of the legislature, governor's office, Department of Ag to get the funding to get it up and going. So that's a little example of how some of that works on a small scale. On a larger scale, through that work, we identify issues within not only agriculture, but business in general, where maybe policy changes need to happen. One of those we recognized last year was through the BRC, and agriculture in particular is usually privately owned. If you want to put a processing plant up on your own land, it's private owned land. And in that case, BRC funding doesn't work. So we help identify those bigger issues as well to keep the ball rolling forward. So our hands aren't tied. Does that answer your question?
Representative Larson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. When you get these requests, do you send them out to the regional directors? And if you do, after they've been processed a bit further, I would guess, you include legislators to kind of meet with them so we could kind of have an idea of what's going on?
Mr. Chairman, lots of times the requests come from you guys. You're calling me with a constituent that needs a little help. And on the other side, lots of times they're a confidential projects. And so we do have limitations with NDAs. But yes, happy to include you where we can.
Well, concerning the policy changes that would be necessary to advance agriculture, I guess, might be depending on the business council for whatever changes we need in order to accomplish the vision we have for agriculture. So be mindful of that as we go through. Get into bills we have, I appreciate it. So. What?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and great questions, members of the committee. I think that's a key point that we want to impress is that we definitely see this as collaborative. And as you mentioned, how do we help execute the vision and how do we all work together? Because I think, the legislature has a certain size and amount of time you can work on things. We do too, but I think together we can make a difference. And so that's a big deal. If you take a look at what I call our three levers that we can pull, we really have funding sources, policy and the regulatory environment, and then we have leadership and communication. And those are the things that we can make the most difference in. And I think it's definitely got to have a close collaboration. If we take a look at funding, as Jill mentioned, and I think it's been answered her out a little bit, the Business Ready Communities, or BRC program, has been our program that is funded a number of community projects and businesses to expand and grow or to relocate here over the last few years. The other program that we have I think can be very successful now with some of the changes that have been made in last year's session are around the large loan program. And sir, these aren't listed on this slide, but those are some of the elements that we use. We also have some access to broadband funds, and again, that legislation has been changed to make it easier for us to utilize and implement.
Question, Representative Porter.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You guys take federal funding of any kind, strings are attached. How many provisions are set in place to make the dance to making this kind of money? Because I got a bill set, getting processed right now that talks about that. Can you tell me how this works?
Mr. Chairman and Representative Portner, that's a great question. I think it depends on the program. What I have the most experience with, and I think our agency probably has the most experience with, is the CARES Act funding. And the strings on that are maybe a little less than some others. We've had in the past programs like the energy program that now belongs to the Wyoming Energy Authority. We moved that to them. And so it had a number of reporting elements and a number of things that we had to provide, not just information to, but we also had to check up and work on. So I think the point I see is that with any federal funding, there is an administrative cost and administrative burden that is taken upon the agency in order to utilize that funding. It's something that you have to balance carefully, right? Sometimes the benefit to the state may not be almost not worth the administrative burden. And so it's something that's important to us to look at. I don't know if that answers your question specifically, but it's something that we look at in each program.
I've been hearing horror stories about a lot of these loans that's coming from the federal government. That's why I asked. Thank you.
Representative Clausen.
Mr. Chairman, Director, you mentioned the large load program. Could you just go over that really quickly? Because we're looking at the bonding of the authority, and I think we're looking at a fairly major gap in the state of Wyoming, and I think there's a. What's the question? Speak up.
Yeah.
Could you go over the large loan program? You missed that, how it works, where the funds come from.
Yes, Mr. Chairman and Representative Fawcett. So the large loan program is a program that is it's funded through it's appropriated through the general fund. There's a fund that's available to us to make loans directly to business entities and through it's actually through the treasurer's office, the governor's office, and us, and how they can basically, it means that you can do projects. I believe I'm not sure what the upper limit is, but it's they have to have 25% collateralized, and there's a 1% fee attached to that. But that program, there's only been one large loan ever executed to date. And that was due to some challenges with the way the legislation was written in order for the approval process. However, that's been changed that was changed in 2020 session. And so now, as of July 1st, those come through us. We work those loans with, and then we go to the treasurer's office and the governor's office, and the three of us go together. Does that answer your question?
Follow, Mr. Chairman. Go ahead. So just, I'm thinking of the different authorities and through the WCDA. We have a large gap left in our bonding authority, or our tax exempt bonds. So basically, that's just half, and this is for low income housing. Is there an avenue through your agency, so if somebody comes in with a large project that you can assist to go through the private capital market, or is that simply up to the person with the project to go through it? Or do you have expertise somewhere? How would something like that work, or is that not something we guys do?
Mr. Chairman and Representative Clausen, it's possible that we would look at it. And then what we do is we have a number of folks on our investment team as well as our services team that, we would like to look at those deals and see if there's an applicable program that we have, or if we can help them find the applicable program. We may or may not be able to help in that regard, but the large loan program could possibly, and I could be happy to get you more information on it.
More?
Yeah, just a couple quick notes on our three levers. I think the CARES Act and the work that we did over the course of last year was an example of what we may be doing in the future with the American Rescue Plan Act and how we might utilize those federal funds to help. And Mr. Chairman, you asked about whether those funds maybe had less strings or were less tight about what could be done with them. What we know is that there is a longer term. So it is, I think, 3.5 to 4 year term that we can utilize these funds, which is more helpful than the 1 year that we had, or 6 months in some cases. So we know that there's a longer term. We also are beginning to understand the guidance around that. And while at first we were very excited because we thought of it would be much more about stimulating the economy and looking forward into the future, and rather than relief, which is looking backward, we see that there's some opportunities to do that, but it's not as clear that it is, it's not somewhere in the middle, let's say, between relief and full-on stimulus. So we're still working on the guidance there. The Business Council is also leading the charge from an economic development standpoint to understand what communities and businesses need for economic development and how they've been impacted by the pandemic. So that is something that we are working hard to gather information in and develop plans to utilize this funding. Thank you. And I guess to leave everyone with our thinking, and I think, Mr. Chairman, you mentioned it, to execute the vision of the Agriculture Committee is something it's going to take a lot of effort. It's going to take time. It's going to take energy. I do think it's time for us to be big and bold with our vision and with the execution of it. One of the conversations we had early this morning was about the idea of having a vision and wanting to get there really, really quickly and saying, oh gosh, we're not there yet, so we must be failing. And I guess the way we're looking at it at the Business Council for not just agriculture, but also the entire economy is how do we see that vision out there, but then realizing it's a complex problem, take that next step, then assess the situation, take another step, assess the situation, and continue along, realizing it may not be a complete straight shot, but it's something that we're going to take small bites of and keep working toward. I think that's likely how the Business Council will help the most, is just understanding that it's a complex problem and not one shot and one silver bullet that's going to make it happen. Thank you.
Yes, Representative Clausen.
So a little bit of a statement, a little bit of background, because you haven't been around for the conversation over the last year, and then a little bit of maybe a vision, or if there's been conversation for the future. But we realized that we had a crisis last year during the COVID thing with the meat processing, and that's why we put so much emphasis on it, I'd say, in this committee. Saw the entire collapse of the large commercial basically processing. We had shortages in grocery stores. We had hogs, especially backing up back east, and that'd be euthanized. I mean, we had a major problem that was exposed. And I think the numbers we realized, USDA and state inspected, we were under 2,000 head a year in the state of Wyoming. And that brings to, in the ag sector, that brings, it doesn't matter how much we market if we can't get our product out. And that seemed to be something that really was huge and immediate last year, and I think it's still huge today. The profiteering or the economics that go on to the state of Wyoming right now because of that. We have about, if you look at the USDA statistics, 1.32 million, if you round that down to a million head of cattle. Last week, the profiteering from the processing sector was roughly $750 a head. If we were able to capture even 25% of that, it would be a $200 million annual boost to the economy of the state of Wyoming. I mean, whether you could capture if you could capture that to the commodity side and still keep your processing facility profiteering at a 2/3. There's a lot of room is what I'm saying. I know this is rambling, but getting down the road, looking to those solutions, one of those that we looked at last year for a large scale thing was shifting more to an authority model. And we didn't get that through on the House side by one vote, but I think in looking at the conversation, have you guys looked at shifting some of the business council in entirety to more of the authority model, because it seems to be successful. As far as in the low income housing financing side, there's still a lot of room in our bonding caps for tax exempt. Is there conversations, or do you guys have the ability to do that now? Because it seems like there's a gap there in that large financing for not just the ag sector, but in the entire business sector. There's the energy portion that's taken care of by the authority. There's the low income real estate that WCDA has, but in business in general, do you see that? Has that been part of the conversation, or am I getting way out ahead of where everybody's?
Mr. Chairman and Representative Clausen, the short answer is no. I haven't been involved in those conversations, and we haven't really contemplated that, at least so far. Is it a good question? Something we should explore? I think it might be something that we should explore, and at least think about, and understand why or why not to do that. So thank you. But the short answer is no.
Yeah. Any comments, public comment? This would be probably a good time. You're finished with your presentation.
Yes, sir. If there are any questions or comments, we're happy to stand for them.
It looks like no questions, so, but you'll be around for a bit, so we may have some this.
Yeah, and we'll be available, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
So, public comment? Okay. Online?
Mr. Chairman, we do have Mr. Bud from there. What he wants to speak on this. Okay, so I'll just need to place in the minute. And then also Donna from LSO, she commented that she has some answers to several of the committee questions concerning IRBs. If you wish to hear.
Yeah, let's have those now. And any of members of the public that wanted to comment, we'll have you right afterwards. Okay. Donna, are you there?
Hello, Mr. Chairman. I did get some answers to some of the questions that you and the other committee members posed.
Donna, we can hear you.
Are you able to hear me?
It's a little faint. Where's our little?
Hey, Don, if you try again, I think we just have to increase volume on the TV.
Okay. Can you hear me now?
No, I think we need to increase volume on that TV a little bit. Well, we were able to hear you, now we can't. I mean, you're very faint.
Mr. Chairman, can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you, but you're very faint.
How about now?
Same thing.
Heather, is there a mute button right here on this corner?
There he is. Oh, no, we can't hear her, so I'm just touching it.
Hey, Donna, can you hear us?
I can hear you. Can you hear me?
I can. You're super low. Can you speak again, Donna, please?
Hi, can you hear me now? Let me try changing my mic and see.
Here, we got you.
Better.
We got you.
Okay, we can hear you now. Go ahead.
Okay, all right. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. There were several questions that were asked at the end of my presentation, and I reached out to the bond counsel that WCDA uses for their mortgage revenue bonds. They also do industrial revenue bonds, and I got some answers for you. So the first question was, could industrial revenue bonds be used as matching funds for the new Wyoming Meat Processing Expansion Grant Program? And the answer is yes, but because the grant is a small, we're talking about a small amount of money, $1 million grant, it may not be practical from a cost perspective to use a revenue bond. The bond counsel said generally, if you're issuing a bond on the bond market, you're going to spend between $60,000 and $70,000 in banking and legal fees. You might be able to get those costs down to $25,000 if you can find a bank that wants to buy the bond. But it, you know, those costs may be prohibitive if you're just talking about financing $1 million. And then the second question was, is there a limit on the dollar amount of taxable revenue bonds that can be issued? And the answer is no. Taxable bonds are not regulated by the Internal Revenue Code, so there's no dollar limit, with one exception. And this gets at the third question. If you're using taxable bonds in combination with tax-exempt bonds, which you are allowed to do, that was one of the questions, can you do that? The Internal Revenue Code does limit the total cost of the project to $20 million. So you could use a $10 million tax-exempt bond to finance a project like a meat packing plant. And you could use up to another $10 million in taxable bonds to finance the project, but the total cost of the project could only be $20 million. So I hope that answered your questions.
Questions from the committee for Donna right now? Representative Fortner.
Thank you, Chairman. This money that's going to be spent by Wyoming government, is it going to have to stay in Wyoming? It can't go outside Wyoming borders. Is that right? Or is that wrong?
Mr. Chairman, I'm not understood. I'm not sure I understood the question. Is the question whether projects financed with revenue bonds have to be within the state or outside of the state?
Yes, ma'am. If they're issued inside our state, they're going to have to stay inside state boundaries, right?
I believe that's probably addressed in statute, in the state statutes. That's something I'll have to look up.
Thank you.
I think it's something that we can address in our legislation if we pass some legislation to make sure that the businesses that we're trying to establish would be Wyoming businesses and based in Wyoming. Okay, no further questions. Oh, you have a question? Go ahead.
No, Mr. Chairman, it looks like there are no questions.
Okay.
So to wrap up the first part of this morning, committee, the way I see it, we have two general options. I don't know if we want to choose one path or the other right now. I think one thing we need to consider is looking at our current statutes with the industrial revenue bonds that we discussed, just leveraging that capacity we currently have and making sure that everybody makes it clear that those can be used for agricultural processing facilities. And we could also, if we have a bill draft that makes that clear, and also puts some sideboards on, for example, make sure that it is, used within the state of Wyoming, make sure that a big multinational monopoly can't come in and leverage that. For example, I think there's good sideboards we can put on that capacity at the state level, recognize that there is a significant amount of capacity for those tax-free bonds. So that would be, as we think about that forward, I think that'd be at least one option we want for a bill draft at our second committee meeting is, and there's even, there's a similar piece of legislation from 2011 that did something similar for energy related projects. It could be as simple as modifying the definition, specifying specifically ag related facilities are allowed under IRBs and setting up what parameters we want to make sure that it's spent correctly. So, Mr. Chairman, I guess I'll make a motion then to get a bill draft going for the second committee meeting that would provide those sideboards in the industrial revenue bond statutes. And it's a 15-1-700 series specifically, but that'd be a motion for a bill draft, Mr. Chairman.
Seconded by Wasserberg. Discussion. We didn't have any public comment. Let me just back up.
We did, Mr. Chairman, yes.
Well, okay. All right. Discussion on the motion. Question on the motion. This would be a motion to have a draft bill drafted for the next meeting for our consideration that would be related to the Ag Authority, similar concept.
No, Mr. Chairman, that's not the motion at all. It's not the Ag Authority. We'd simply be going into 15-1-700 and using the industrial revenue bond authority that we discussed and making sure that it is for agriculture. That's specified. It's not the Ag Authority at all. So that's the motion.
Okay. Mr. Representative, that sounds pretty simple. Is that simple?
Well, in fact, it is. I mean, we have that $150 million capacity just sitting there that we're not using as a state. So all that we'd be doing is pointing, drawing attention to it and setting up how we want ag-related development to happen under that current authority. So yeah, we're leveraging what we already have instead of grants.
Question be called. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Okay. We will. Senator Wasserberg.
No, I just raised my hand while I voted.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I don't think we need to.
Double aye.
I don't. think we need to do, right? I don't. Yeah, I don't believe we need a head count. Okay. So you have that, Heather?
Yes, Mr. Chairman.
All right. We need to take a break or, okay, let's take a real quick one and then we'll start in because we're running a little bit behind. As is the case in most of my.
Mr. Chairman, when do you want to come back?
Hello. I'm not hearing anybody. Can you hear me? Hello? No. Can you hear me? No. 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 On my computer, you mean? Okay. Oh, now I'm hearing something. Oh, not anymore.
Hello, 1, 2.
Oh, there he is. Nope, he's gone. Oh, he's back. Nope, gone again.
That's all we can do though.
Oh, I'm hearing something. Oh, I'm getting lots of feedback. No.
Hello, Alyssa. Can you hear us now?
Yes.
You can.
Yep.
So it's something where you just moved right there. Something where you just moved. I can see it on the screen. See how I can see the bar move right there? Yeah. That means we're up.
Yep, I can hear you guys good.
Yeah, it could have been there. Okay. So you can hear us good?
Yep.
All right. Real good?
Yep, real good.
Alyssa, I'm gonna let you go.
Okay, bye.
Test, test. So you should be able to hear that on the Zoom call now.
Yes, yep, I hear you.
Yep, you hear us? Okay.
Yep.
Alyssa, you need to mute your mic, please.
Testing.
All right, well, while he's explaining that, we have a little difference in procedure here. We're not going to be picked up on YouTube or amongst us any other way than talking into the mic. So when you talk, push the button, have a green light like I tried to do the first time. He's fixing that one. But we'll share the mics as need be, but so that'll be the main difference. So our next. Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I neglected to mention during the housekeeping that, and my co-chairman covered pretty well, you know, the chairman don't have to be the only ones to come up with bill draft ideas. We're here to hear from you. You know, if you have any ideas for legislation, definitely want to hear them. And frankly, I get a little nervous if I'm the only one making bill draft recommendations. So by all means, you know, the more the merrier. Maybe our LSO staff disagrees, but I just wanted to throw that out there and put less than 5 point on it. Also, I think the default assumptions that we're making a bill draft for the next budget session in 2022, but we also have that potential for a special session coming up in July. So if you want to make a bill draft that we consider as a committee for that July special session dealing with ARP funds, you can make that motion as well if you want. It's on the table. So and then of course we'd have to have a follow-up quick meeting as we came to Cheyenne in July to vote ultimately whether we approve or disapprove it as a committee. So that's a very fluid situation. At this point, I'm not sure if we're 100% sure if we're even going to have a special session, though it's looking likely. So just thought I'd throw that out there for the committee's consideration as we move forward.
Next item will be the ag-related agencies and roles. And Doug Miyamoto, Director of our Department of Ag, you are first, and I can proceed as you're ready.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good day, committee. Again, Doug Miyamoto, Wyoming Department of Agriculture. I submitted in your packet a breakdown of some slides about the general function of the Department of Agriculture, and I don't want to read those slides to you today, so I was going to highlight some key parts of this presentation that are more in tune with, I think, the information that the committee is looking for. If at any time you run into any questions that you have about anything that I go over, please let me know and I'll try to clarify as best I can. So you can see the presentation is up, but if I could just skip over to the WDA overview slide. The rest of these are statistics on Wyoming agriculture generally. They might be good for review, but they're not anything that I'm going to highlight today. So keep going. There we go. Okay, so this is what our department looks like today. We have 5 divisions and about 86 employees, so that gives you an idea of scope and scale. We look at our role as consumer protection and then also working on behalf of our agricultural producers in different ways. And I'll go through each one of these divisions and let you know generally what we do and what our statutory charges are. We try to focus a lot on customer service and education. Program management is obviously important. We do have a lot of agreements with federal government, and so program management becomes important. In our regulatory functions, we always try to focus on education first and try to educate our way into compliance with generally the federal regulations. That's our chosen path. Okay, next slide, please. We have myself and a deputy director of whom many of you know, Stacia Berry. We work with our Board of Agriculture as well, and they set forward some of the policies that we try to follow generally. And they also have some statutory connection to some different funding mechanisms for different subsidiaries of government, such as conservation districts, weed and pest districts, predator boards, those types of entities that work through the Department of Agriculture. Next slide. Like every agency, we have a small admin division, and they do the things that you would expect an administrative division to do. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on, I think, registration. So next slide, please. Okay, this is our analytical services lab. This does, I don't know how many of you know this, but the Department of Agriculture employs the Wyoming State Chemist as well. And so we have a lab facility over there in Laramie that's upstairs from the vet lab. It's part of the University of Wyoming campus. But generally, what this lab is used for is to analyze the samples that we take from our regulatory program. So dairy products, meat products, the other food products that we have regulatory control over, that's where all of the sampling for truth in labeling comes to fruition. So if you have a product on the grocery store and it claims its ingredients and its proportion of those ingredients, if we get any complaints about food items in the state, that's where those go to be verified. So we're checking for label compliance, and we're also checking for potentially hazardous substances in dairy products that we have oversight over. So our technicians in the field go and get those samples, and then they'll submit those to the analytical services lab. And they're the ones that'll conduct the tests on those samples that we submit. Many of you remember one of the most recent charges of the analytical services lab was to also test a lot of hemp products. So with the passage of that bill and our launching of our industrial hemp program, this is where we confirm compliance of the THC concentration of those hemp products, generally speaking. We also do a lot of service type sampling at the services lab. If you want baseline water quality samples for a well that you drilled, we can test that for different constituents for water quality. We do that on behalf of city and county governments as well, some industry and private sector contributions to our sample logs. But generally speaking, the main function of that lab is to integrate the inspectors that we have in the field and to provide the necessary backup federal requirements for us to maintain delegated authority for these programs. There's a certain amount of testing that we have to do to verify compliance of our state program with the federal regulations. And so you can see here USDA meat waters swabs from the different meat plants. We have a testing scheme for all of our FDA approved dairies. Many of you know about the work that we do with gas stations. So testing for octane levels, winterized diesel fuel, fuel quality constituents, all of that is run through this same lab. We also test a lot of pesticides, and we test pesticides in the same way generally that we do food and other products. Make sure we have label compliance, concentrations are correct. If anybody has a complaint about a pesticide that's being sold in the state of Wyoming and they're wondering what's in it, we'll run the analysis on those products that are submitted to the lab as well. We obviously look at animal feed, so you'll have claims of supplements sometimes, percentages of crude protein, so forth, that people may doubt, and they can submit those samples to our lab and we can verify whether or not that feed product is in compliance with this label. Test fertilizers in the same way.
Director, so before I forget it, again, I was going to ask the business council, and on our USDA meat plants, we have 9 of them now. What is prohibiting some of our state inspected plants from just going to USDA? It sounds to me like they have to have at least the same level of requirements as USDA. What do you think might be preventing all of the meat processing plants from going to USDA, other than wild game and things like that?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think what prevents plants from switching is sometimes it has to do with the inspectors. They form a close relationship with the inspectors. So we had a plant that was managed in Hudson, Wyoming for a number of years, and they were comfortable with the inspector that they had. It was a state inspected facility. Has undergone an ownership change, and they have recently migrated towards federal inspection. Now, all of the requirements that are in the state inspected plants are not exactly the same as federal. So there's a phrase that's used a lot, and it's same as or equal to. So for a processing plant to become licensed by the state, we have to ensure that its safety parameters are equal to those of the federal government, but they don't have to be the same as. So to be a USDA plant, there's a USDA inspector that's assigned to that plant. They have to provide office space in the plant for that USDA inspector. They obviously use USDA software. There's different ADA accessible considerations and plant layouts that may be slightly different from what a state plant could be. So the requirements aren't exactly the same. But I get this question a lot, and I think the meat of what you may be looking for is the reason state inspection exists as an entity is that there was a time when federal inspection was hard to come by. And just because you wanted to be a USDA plant and you requested inspection from USDA didn't necessarily mean that you were going to get it. So the only way that you could legally take meat into commerce, into the marketplace, is either through one of two different pathways. One would be state inspection, the other one would be federal. And if you can't get a federal inspector on site, the next best thing is let's become a state inspected facility. And that's generally how our program came to be, was to fill a gap that was needed in the processing world. Some of those plants prefer to undergo state inspection as opposed to federal. Today, when I'm asked if somebody is launching a plant from the ground up, generally they will have more opportunity if they become a federal plant. And we will lay out the differences for prospective plant operators as to what those differences are and what it means for their operation. And then they can make an informed decision about where they would like to take their product, because really that's the resulting answer to the equation is, do you want to be able to sell that product either interstate or internationally? And if you do,
Right, so do we still have this shortage on the federal meat inspectors or state inspectors? In either?
Mr. Chairman, I think it would be fair for me to say we don't have the number of inspectors on the state side of our program that makes me feel comfortable. And the reason that I say that is we have to have a state inspector in that plant every day that they're doing slaughter. They have to be there for every slaughter event. Each head of cattle have to be inspected for humane handling and slaughter provisions. Also that those are federal regulations, but we're there to make sure that that happens. And we have to be there for every head of slaughter. And then every day that they're processing, we have to stop in that plant, and there's certain checklists that we have to go through every day that they're processing. So that's state inspection generally. Where that leaves us as a department is sometimes if we have an employee that is ill, we have to scramble to get another certified meat inspector to a plant that may be several counties away. We have them distributed fairly well. So right now we're able to handle that. And because people have been going more towards the federal side than they have the state inspected side, we've been able to manage that demand fairly well on the state side. Do we have enough federal inspectors? I think we're going to run into some issues there because every state in the union is taking an exceptional interest in meat processing. We're not the only state that is looking at this trend of wanting to decentralize meat processing within their own states. And I think that there's a likelihood that there will be a much higher demand for federal inspectors than there has been in the recent past. So I'm impressed by the growth that we've been able to undertake in the last several years. It wasn't that long ago that this agency was in front of this committee saying we would like a federal plant we don't have. That was probably 6, 7 years ago now. Mr. Chairman, I think the short answer to your question is I would like a couple of roving inspectors that could fill gaps for us. Or if we see an exceptional increase in the number of plants around the state generally, and the federal government can't fulfill the inspection requests that they get, I would like for those operators to be able to use us as backup to where we can get them up and going. And I can use some examples for you. 307 meets, when it launched, it was always seeking federal inspection, and that was their goal. But there was a time after they were ready to launch that the federal government didn't have an inspector for them. And we did provide this gap inspection. It wasn't very long, it was just a matter of months. But we were the only inspection service that was available to them that allowed them to open before they otherwise would have been able to. That was under an agreement with USDA that we fulfilled, substituting essentially on behalf. So that's the status of our inspection.
So there is, do you think we could use some of this new funding that's been sent our way or leftover CARES funding to, I don't know what you do, you must have to train these inspectors. As part of the workforce that seems to be limiting our processing plants.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, that was a thought that we had as a department, was to explore the potential of using any of those federal funds to hire additional inspectors, but because of the nature of the funding being one time and no way to really carry that funding forward, and given the original expiration date of the CARES Act funding, we didn't pursue hiring any employees under those funds. And that's the reason why it wasn't a model that we could carry forward, and it wasn't sustainable for us to be able to ensure that we were going to be able to keep that inspection service.
There are no questions, but I think that's a classic example of why government expands. Yeah.
If we could skip now to the Consumer Health Services slide. There we go. Okay, this is the division that houses the meat inspectors. And so that's what they're looking for generally, is ensuring the safety of the food supply. And they inspect licensed food establishments, and they inspect meat plants. And the way that I look at CHS is food is the ultimate product, or it's the primary product anyway, of agriculture. And so this is kind of the way to make sure that the products that our citizens are consuming and that we're sending out are wholesome, and they meet the federal requirements that they have to, whether we do it or not. Next slide, please. So our inspectors conduct food safety education and inspections for all areas of the state, but we do have a provision that allows, like a county health department, to receive delegated authority from us. And if they want to operate their own food safety system within their counties, then they can do that. You can see, I have an example. These are the ones that currently operate at the county level, and they do so in cooperation with us. And the way that this works is there's an inspection fee, and up till very recently, that was a $100 initial fee, and then it was a $50 renewal fee. When these counties undertake their own inspection items, we send that money to them. And so that's how we kind of share the responsibility of food inspection. I think that these programs are best served at the local level if and when you get that. But for most of the state, they don't have inspectors that are certified in this way, this expertise, and so we end up doing the inspections in all of these 6 counties.
We've got a question.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. With those local health departments, I understand you send the fees back to those counties, but are there any general funds that go to support those local programs, or is it all locally funded outside of the fees?
Mr. Chairman, outside of the fees, those are locally funded.
Follow-up, and well, not a follow-up, totally different one. But When you look at all the, the laundry list, I guess maybe I'm a little bit at one slide ahead of you, but you have the meat and restaurant inspectors. It's my understanding that those are sort of the same people and they'll do a little bit more. Is that correct?
That's correct. Yes, the staff, Mr. Chairman, is set up regionally with the certifications that they need given for the area that they serve. So if you have a dairy in your region, then you need to be a certified dairy inspector. Obviously, meat plants and general food safety, and what that boils down to basically is a phrase called hazard analysis critical control point. And so that mechanism is used in meat plants. It's also used in restaurants. It's used in hospital cafeterias, and it's used in our manufactured food facilities. And so one of the common products for manufactured foods in the state of Wyoming is, let's take a barbecue sauce manufacturer. We would use the same protocol to inspect that factory as a restaurant or a meat plant as well. And so that's how the inspection scheme does work.
So, Mr. Chairman, of that list, I guess it could be helpful for me to know which people do the same ones. I think I understand the meat and the restaurants are done by the same people, but I don't know, the same people who do the meat inspections, the same people who do the pool inspections, or does everybody do everything, or is it divvied up?
Mr. Chairman, not in every case does the inspector do all types of inspection, but that is generally the way that it works. Yes, most of them have expertise that allows them to. The pool inspections aren't as complicated. The hardest one is for meat inspection. To get certified for that takes some training and a process. Restaurants are one step down from meat plants, in my estimation. Most of them do at least meat plants and restaurants. And then we have several of them, obviously, that do pools that may go into other areas. Like I said, there may be an inspector whose time is generally taken up by meat inspection. If they're slaughtering 3 days a week, then they're committed and they need to be at that point on those days. And if they're processing on the other 2 days of the week, that doesn't leave them a lot of time to go out and do inspections. And so we do have some that tend to key more in on one specialty versus the other, but most of them do at least meat inspection. Most of those also do some pools and some grocery stores. Okay, if we could go to the natural resources slide, please. There we go. Okay, natural resources. This is kind of the policy side of the Department of Agriculture. And what these folks do is they look at the Federal Register every day and they scan that list of federal actions that are forthcoming. So they're looking for allotment management plans or forest plans, that type of federal policy. It tends to focus mostly on federal land management type of issues. And they provide comments on behalf of topics such as wild horse gathers or anything related to natural resource type of management. Sage grouse was a big topic for this group over the past decade. So what they're trying to do there is make sure that there is at least a voice or a seat at the table recognizing agriculture and the role of federal land management policy, given that half of the state's land is administered by. Next slide, please. Okay. One of the biggest processes that we deal with all the time is NEPA, the National Environmental Policy Act. This takes up a lot of time, but it is a box that needs checked in order for us to carry on, even with grazing permit renewals. So we tried to take our policy that our board and that this is the department follow through on and protect federal grazing rights as best we can. We do some work in water quality as well. and we've done a lot of work in endangered species. Next slide, please. Okay, this is our mediation program, and we have a lot of examples of how this program is used, but one that may resonate here with this committee are that if we have permittees, as an example, that don't agree with the decision by Forest Service, they have a neighbor dispute, and they don't necessarily want to go all the way through some adjudication process in the courts. We can try to help them solve that issue through a consensus building process. So we have one staff person that works on that as well. Okay, next slide, please. We also are part of a team along with DEQ and the Game and Fish that helps out in the Jonah Infield and the Pinedale Project Office. And these are mitigation funds that were set up in a record of decision where the drillers either paid an amount of money up front for mitigation, or they do so on an as spudded well type of process where they have money for habitat projects and for natural resource management in those areas. We participate in that as well. Next slide. Similar to that is the Western Landscape Conservation Initiative. This was brought on by the Department of Interior many years ago. It has waned somewhat in recent years. We are still active, and we still do offer our recommendations on the value of projects that are being and help that office as best we can. Next slide. We have a statutory connection to our conservation districts. There's 34 of them. We try to help them check the boxes of compliance with the Administrative Procedures Act. Our board, the Wyoming Board of Agriculture, codifies changes in the individual conservation district board, some designs and needs of replacement. This is where the Board of Ag comes in. Basically checks that they're compliant. So we try to provide training and assistance to conservation. Next slide. Okay, our technical services division. This is weights and measures, generally speaking. It also is a consumer protection program. Anything that is sold by mass or volume, we're the ones that make sure that a pound equals a pound and a gallon equals a gallon. So we have scale trucks that go out and certify all of our livestock scales, all of our roadside port of entry scales. We certify gas pumps to make sure that when you pay for a gallon of gas, you get a gallon of gas. That's the type of work that the Weights and Measures Division Department does. Also supports the plant industry programs and pesticides, again, for consumer protection. When you buy seeds or when you buy plant materials, we want to make sure that what you're paying for is what you're getting. So we do a lot of work in the nursery stock realm, and you might see our inspectors at a Lowe's or a Home Depot looking at ornamental plants. What they're checking for is to make sure there isn't any noxious invasive weeds that are growing. We do a perfect job of that? Obviously not, but we do go out and look for it as best. Next slide, please. Okay, so who are our customers in technical services? Generally looking at weed and pest districts. You're also looking at predator boards at the county. We're the ones that provide some technical support and pass-through funding for both of those local entities. Next slide, please. We'll get into a little bit more of technical services in the predator management realm tomorrow, but generally speaking, this is where our predator coordinator resides, is within the technical services division of the Department of Ag. And we'll issue aerial hunting permits for those folks. And we also license a lot of the entities that sell pesticides. Okay, next slide. This is a list of the work that we generally do in the pesticide. You can see that if you want to be a private applicator or you want to be a commercial applicator, The way that works is the University of Wyoming supplies the education, we supply the test proctoring methods for becoming a commercial or private applicator, all of the records of those licenses. And so we are the only state, I believe, in the United States that does not have pesticide enforcement as part of our responsibility. That was done. A lot of the states, we had a question earlier, what are the strings that are attached to some of the funding? Well, this is one where the price was too high in our estimation. We do get some funding from the federal government for our pesticide education outreach, making sure we're issuing licenses correctly and keeping all of the records. When it comes to pesticide enforcement actions, that's something that we have left to DLIS, or TDA, I'm sorry. So we don't go out and do any of the enforcement of pesticide violations at all. But we do certify people to go out and apply restricted use chemicals. So if somebody goes out and they apply a restricted use chemical and they do it in a way that's not compliant with the label, really our only regulatory mechanism is to withhold the license. And we do have some misdemeanor provisions. So we're more on the education side of pesticides than we are compliance, other than when it comes to the labels and the contents of that pesticide, and then its application by our certified applicator. Next slide, please. Within the plant industry, you can see the list here of the products that we test and keep tabs on, generally speaking. We want to make sure seeds are viable and that they're the seeds that the companies are saying that's in the bag, and that it will germinate according to what it says it will. Nursery stock, same type of thing, but you can see there's a list here, and it goes all the way down to dog food, any kind of animal feeds at all. We do receive complaints from time to time about potential poisons in pet foods, as an example. We can go out to a feed store and stab that bag and get a sample and go check it out. Anything else that shouldn't be in that feed, that is. And so we do that on a request basis, and then from time to time we check on feed content as well. Next slide, please. Here is a list of all of the programs that we operate in relation to our rodent and predator programs. And so we do have a little bit of money for rabies management, just like we do training for M44s and grant assistance to our county districts. And that's the biggest chunk of our predator programs, is the money that goes through our animal damage to support the local programs. Next slide, please. I went over this a little bit, but this is what we do with seeds. We do this in cooperation with the university. Sorry, I could hear that ringing in my head. I thought it was maybe too loud. So anyway, Seed Lab, that is something that's operated by the University of Wyoming with our support, and we pass through funding to the university to administer that. Next slide, please. Weed and Pest. I know you as a group of legislators have done a lot of work in the weed and pest realm over the past couple of years, of which we're greatly appreciative. So thank you for that. It's been very good. We're in support of those local entities. Our goal is to make the administration of weed and pest as local as we can get it, and try to support the efforts of the weed pest districts around the state and pass through funding so that they can undertake their programs. Next slide. I believe we've already been through. This again is weights and measures. So That one is fairly straightforward, but I think a lot of people don't realize how in-depth that is. So every one of those grocery store scanners that also weighs, we certify all of those. We make sure that the scanners are reading correctly. All of the compliance with any of those devices fall under the jurisdiction of the Department of Ag. And so if you go to a grocery store or a Walmart, or whatever the case may be, you'll see a sticker that's on that instrument that indicates that we've taken a look at that scale and made sure it's operating correctly. Next slide. These are all of our, what I would consider our customers to be. The Fair Board, Ag in the Classroom, Beef Council, our conservation districts. We also now house the Dry Bean Commission and the Wheat Commission. We have ADMB and we have the Wheat Pest Council. All are subsidiaries of the department. Service to the best. With that, Mr. Chairman, I'd be happy to take any questions.
Representative Fortner.
Mr. Chairman, Representative, we have several programs that we do have cooperative agreements that supply federal funding in support of our state program. So the main one that we've been talking a lot about is the meat inspection. We do get some cost share funds from the federal government to help support our inspectors, but it's less than half in just that one division. And largely speaking, on the broader context of the Department of Agriculture, most of our funding comes from the legislature and the general fund appropriations of the state. So when we've had federal shutdowns that have become commonplace would be too strong a word, but we've had more than what we had experienced prior to that. We've had something like that in the last 5 years, some of them lengthy. We haven't had very much impact from that at all. So I would like to think that our agency can carry on its work, maybe at a reduced scale, but we aren't that dependent on federal money. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Director. So your presentation is done.
Yes, sir.
Wyoming Livestock Board. Mr. Crew, come on up.
Mr. Chairman, committee, thank you for the opportunity to present before you today. As part of my update, I was going to let you know on some board changes. We had a very transitional year in our board members. This is our new board president, Sean Sims from State District 3, to present with us today. So briefly, we don't have a PowerPoint division. So Mr. Chairman, all you got from us was a quick little organizational chart based on two reasons. One, we wanted to show you how we've streamlined the agency over the last few years in the way our org chart has consolidated and will continue to do so. We have some vacancies that we're working on right now, and we intend to not only streamline reporting lines, but also work within that efficiency study that came from your group a few years ago in the number of direct reports. So as you notice, the board is pretty high on our organizational chart, Mr. Chairman, and I'd like to represent that in a couple of different fashions that historically, in my perception, well, first off, we are a constitutionally based organization based on Article 19, Section 1 of Wyoming State Constitution. the legislatures was to protect the producers of the state from disease and theft. It's the short version of that section of the Constitution. This agency was originally put together in 1933. And the importance that we see of the board in the hierarchy or in the organizational chart is this board has a higher realm of policy power than many boards in the state do, based on historical note from the legislatures of those times that the decisions about regulating the industries and enforcing those regulations of the livestock industry should come from the producers themselves. So our board are producer members appointed by the governor. And then they carry the policy-making authority for our organization. We, of course, are a regulatory agency. That is our role. And we regulate based on the statutes written by your branch of government. And we also, this board develops and promulgates the rules and regulations that apply with those or that work with other avenues of things we have to regulate. So that's my quick history lesson, Mr. Chairman. I would note that the board's powers also are delineated in statute in our Title 11, Chapter 18. And I'd not to just go into a little bit of the agency for those of you that are new to the committee or new to the legislature or haven't met with me. We're pretty streamlined. We are there to regulate and enforce and protect the livestock industry from theft and disease. And we do that through the use of 4 units. We have an admin unit, as Director Miyamoto just explained to you with Ag. We're there to support everyone else in the agency and do the personnel, fiscal budget, all of those type of activities. Then we go into 3 other full-time units. The agency has about 113 full-time employees or positions right now. We're hunting some brand inspectors, so I may come to some of you after the meeting in certain areas to see if you have somebody that you might recommend. But our first unit is admin. Second unit would be animal health. That is the state veterinarian, who would be my counterpart, also appointed by the board, has domain over the animal health unit. And in that unit, he has control or regulation over all import requirements, all import regulations, the responsibility for reportable disease surveillance and trace back. I could go into a long list of their duties with big words, and we could save that for Dr. Logan, who is available if you would like him at some time. He's available on your television screen. That is animal health. There is within that unit, there are actually 5 now, because the law enforcement unit is housed under that division. One of those folks is paid for through the brand inspection division. So there's a little blend of fundings there, but there are the 3 veterinarians, 2 animal techs that handle all the import paperwork and calls as they come through, and 2 law enforcement officers in animal health unit. There's also 1 full-time employee in the Riverton office paid through the small brucellosis grant we get from the USDA for our brucellosis enforcement up in that state, or that portion of the state. So that would be animal health. And Mr. Chairman, if there's any questions at any time, feel free to wave at me. Okay. And then our next 2 units are really, we separate law enforcement in our book, in our sub-budget book. So that would be number 3. Number 4 is brand recording inspection. That is the base of what our agency runs on. We have 96 positions for brand inspectors in the state of Wyoming. We have a recording staff of 6. We're also doing some transition there. Just a little bit of information for members. We have about 27,000 current brands legally recorded in the state. That's what that recording unit does, is it makes sure that all those brands are treated as property in a similar way to real estate as state statute says. So that's quite a detailed job. And we do a brand renewal every other year, just finished one this year of about 5,200 brands. So I can save a lot of information on that for the update in the second part of our presentation today. So and then our brand inspectors, who are the third-party neutral identifiers of the ownership of livestock in the state of Wyoming. And they do something that's probably different than a lot of folks look at it. If I'm a brand inspector and I come to Chairman Boner's place to look at cattle, I'm not working for Chairman Boner that day. I'm working for the other producers in the area and the ability to identify livestock. And that's a message we like to send so that people understand what those folks are actually there to do. I will offer one little piece from my update today, just a number. Many of the things we do are not quantifiable in return, but just in the past year, a quick look at our astray and returned and recovered livestock. We sent about 1,100 headed livestock home to the rightful owners this past year for an average market value of $1.4 million through brand inspection and through law enforcement. That's a little more quantifiable system, and in our new computer system, we're progressing each year in our ability to reach out and grab that number and be able to supply that to your agents or to your group. So, Mr. Chairman, that in a nutshell is how our organization flows. And I think we would open to any questions at that time unless my board president has something to add.
Go ahead, Mr. Sims.
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, I appreciate the chance to be here and accompany our director for this update. I think from the board standpoint, our job is to promulgate the rules that the department operates on, but also that we're probably maybe a little more approachable as some of the issues in the country and bring those to the board and direct the questions in that to the board. But with that, I'd just like to thank you for the opportunity to be here today and stand for any questions.
Any questions for either of these gentlemen? Okay. Go ahead. Representative Wharf.
Yes, Mr. Chairman. I just had a question. Was wondering, I know that with the removal of the law enforcement positions, a lot of that has been transferred over to the sheriff's departments. And I wondered how well that process was working as far as getting, I guess, a liaison between your law enforcement guys and the county sheriffs dealing with livestock theft.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Wharf, thank you for the question. That was going to be one of the main points of my update, but we can just do it right now. A few years ago, as you reiterate, our law enforcement group was cut extremely. Last year, last session, not this session, session prior, we came to JAC with an exception request to add an investigator. We only had one at that point in time. The one I had previous burned out in a hurry, trying to cover the state of Wyoming. Joint Appropriations said, sure, you can have the position, but you have to pay for it. So I came to our board, who then we came to our industry groups, and consensus was, yes, we would pay for that from brand inspection fees. So we have two. Their main goal, due to legislation that came from a prior committee here, there was a law enforcement reimbursement account established as some general fund money to reimburse sheriff's offices for unusual expense they might run into in a case of investigating or prosecuting a livestock case. We had no claims on that money in the first year. However, in working with the different sheriffs and the chiefs and sheriffs organization over the past year and a half now, we've formulated an MOU program, which is similar to what the Forest Service and the Sheriff's Office will do for targeted patrol on Forest Service allotments. So on that MOU, for example, we may have and it's all predicated on a caseload or reports from our two investigators. So we may have a region, we'll just pick one, we'll say Lincoln County, where we have an active MOU, where they're worried about, we have a unusual number of missing cases or question brand inspection violations, movement back and forth across the state lines, that sort of thing. So we sit with the sheriff and determine a fair price to put a deputy who is not on schedule, but so he's gonna be overtime, put an overtime deputy in a county vehicle on the roads in the areas where our investigator and brand inspectors have determined there's a need to show that door in the event to either does a couple of real good things. The first thing we always ask them is, you see a rancher working, stop and introduce yourself and tell him why you're there. And the second, they're gonna make some livestock stops. We had a ruling on a court case in the western state of Wyoming, which says, go ahead and make the livestock stops. So we're doing that. So they'll do some of that. And then they're just gonna try and be out there. Most of these sheriffs want their folks out there spring, fall, and when producers are calving, lambing, and there's a lot of tendency to be some slippage under the fence with a baby calf or some lambs, just to be there. Some of your committee has heard me say this before, but for the new ones, I'll say it again. To me, deterrence might be, or to some folks, deterrence might not be measurable. To me, it's pretty measurable. If my reports go down and the producers are thanking the sheriffs and my investigators, we did something right. So if we can get out there and push people to another area to do that sort of activity, yes. So that being said, we are pushing those MOUs very hard. Our two investigators are training. They've done 11 trainings in the last year, even through COVID, teaching livestock law to different agencies. And we have 2 completed MOUs, 4 in the pipeline that are just either waiting for county commissioner approval or the last steps at contracts. Our goal is to have 15 counties in that. And so far, the sheriffs have been very responsive to that. So that's the biggest push that we've made, trying to multiply our force. 2 guys are not going to be in the right place at the right time unless we're extremely lucky. So we're just trying to multiply our force in that avenue. And even though it isn't in the statute, it's something we've always done. Is we train the highway patrol, we train every cadet class, we train. We're working hard to do what we can do with what we've got to make that one.
It's like we don't have any further questions. So thank you, sir.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. We'll be happy to come back for the update.
Okay. Wyoming Development Authority. Oh, I'm on the wrong stuff. There we are. Office of State Lands and Investments. Do we have someone on?
Good afternoon. Mr. Chairman, can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Welcome to our committee. Go ahead.
Thank you.
Start with your presentation when you're ready.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I wanted to say, or to provide my apologies that we are not able to be there in person. We had some scheduling conflicts that were just unfortunately unavoidable. So we do appreciate the ability to appear virtually today. My name's Jennifer Scoggin. I'm the director of the Office of State Lands and Investments, and I have with me Jason Crowder. He is the deputy director. I'm not sure if Bill Crafter, the state forester, is on or not, but I'm sure he's watching. We have a short slide presentation which will help kind of recap some of the materials that we provided to the committee in advance. And I would note that I understand from LSO that when all of our materials came in, we had a big binder clip on them, and they might have all been placed under this number 4 topic, but there are some of our agency reports and updates stuck in there too that are actually relevant to the number 6 topic. So just to let you know that there may have been some confusion there, and we apologize. So OSLI is a bit of a unicorn. We don't really fit squarely within the topic listed on the agenda. We don't perform a regulatory function for the ag industry, and we don't exist wholly to support the ag industry. although we do have some ag-related programs related to what we do. But nevertheless, we thought that we would take an opportunity to remind the committee what we do and for the new members to help educate them. So, wait, Jason, go back. Our mission statement, in my time at OSLI, I've come to realize that not many people truly understand state lands or the Office of State Lands and Investments. So our mission statement is effectively managing natural resources and funds for current and future generations. And as we get into the details of our testimony today, you'll see why that is. So next slide. So this is just a brief organizational chart. The Office of State Lands and Investments is the administrative arm for both the Board of Land Commissioners and the State Loan and Investment Board. We have the statutory responsibility to carry out the policy directives of these two boards. So we'll start on the State Board of Land Commissioners side. You will see that the State Forester and we both report to the State Board of Land Commissioners. The State Forester then oversees the State Forestry Division, although the State Forestry Division is considered a division of the Office of State Lands and Investments as well. The State Forestry Division is headquartered in Cheyenne, although they do have 7 district offices, one in Newcastle, Buffalo, Riverton, Lyman, Pinedale, Casper, and Laramie. Underneath the State Forestry Division, you'll see that the State Trust Land Management Division is also under the Board of Land Commissioners, and that's where we house our grazing leasing, our special use leases, our temporary use permits, easements, land sales and exchanges, and mineral leasing. Then also underneath the State Board of Land Commissioners is our Field Services Division. That's where our appraisers, our GIS folks, our surface lease compliance and inspectors are located. There are a couple of field service offices, field services field offices, one in Lander, one in Buffalo, and one in Meeteetse. Also, our weed and pest program is housed under the Field Services Division. Now, if you look over onto the State Loan and Investment Board side, you'll notice we have the Financial and Administrative Services Division, and that's where our grant and loan programs are housed. Most of the grant and loan programs are related to infrastructure and capital construction projects for cities, towns, counties, special districts. There's also some sort of other oddballs in there. Also, our fiscal contracts are in the Administrative Services Division, and our royalty compliance for our trust land minerals is also housed under that division. I'll note that in fiscal year 2021, OSLI was supported by 100 full-time employees. Of those, I'll give you a breakdown. Forestry, there were 52 full-time employees, 4 seasonal and 5 AWEC. And on the OSLI, the other divisions, we had 48 full-time positions. So next slide, Jason. Let's begin first by discussing the Board of Land Commissioners first, and it is under a constitutional framework. Wyoming Constitution, Article 18, Section 1. In there, the state of Wyoming accepted grants of lands made by the U.S. To the state for educational purposes and for public buildings and institutions. Wyoming Constitution, Article 18, Section 3, that's where it provides that the Board of Land Commissioners has the direction, control, disposition, and care of all lands granted to the state. So essentially, state trust lands are owned by the state and held in a trust for the benefit of public education and other state institutions. And the Board of Land Commissioners act as the trustees of the trust lands. So next slide. So the Board of Land Commissioners is comprised of the 5 highest elected officials. It's the governor, the secretary of state, the state auditor, the state treasurer, and the superintendent of public instruction. And as I mentioned, they're constitutionally charged with optimizing revenue from state trust lands to support public education and the beneficiary institutes, while concurrently striving to protect, conserve, and maintain the lands so that they can be used by future generations. And then you'll see there is a statute there that provides the authority to the board to promulgate and adopt rules that are necessary to carry out these functions. So next. We're also guided by and operate under a number of statutory principles. State trust lands must be managed under a total asset management policy. The state trust lands are intergenerational with a focus on protecting the corpus for the long term. Trust lands should remain a substantial component of the trust portfolio. Leasing shall be provided at a fair market value. of return and investment policies must protect the permanent land fund from the effects of inflation. Next slide. So let's talk quickly about the history and nature of the trust lands. When Wyoming was admitted to the Union in 1890, as I mentioned, the state was granted those certain lands to support education and the institutions. You'll see that in Wyoming, section 16 and 36 in every township within the state are for the support of common schools. In Wyoming, this amounts to a surface area bigger than the state of Connecticut. Next slide. This is a map showing the state of Wyoming's trust lands. They're highlighted in blue. You can see that this is a considerable asset to manage. Next slide. So what are exactly all of the trust assets? As you can see, there's 3.5 million surface acres that we manage. There's 3.9 million mineral acres. And then the state permanent land fund, the majority of revenues collected from the trust lands are deposited into the state permanent land fund. Currently, there's over $4 billion in that fund. Next slide. So who exactly are the state trust land beneficiaries? We've got kind of a list of the funds on the left and the beneficiaries on the right. You'll see there's a number of different funds and a number of different beneficiaries. But suffice it to say that the largest beneficiary that we're working for most of the time is public schools, education, K through 12. Next slide. And just real quickly, when we evaluate a course of action with state trust lands, we follow what are known as the trust land management objectives. There are 3 trust land management objectives. Any proposal to utilize state lands doesn't have to meet all of the objectives. But I'm going to quickly go through those quickly from our highest to lowest priority. So Jason, next slide. So our first priority is to better meet the beneficiaries' short and or long-term objectives. And as you can imagine, we do this through revenue. We're looking to improve income generating potential. We can do it alone or in combination with other state lands. We can block up state lands. We look for single uses that are effective. Are there multiple compatible uses? We're always looking for ways to generate revenue. We also look at investment value. We're looking to improve our returns, improve our portfolio diversification, improve our appreciation potential, and improve natural resource values. Next slide. So the second objective is to improve the manageability of the land asset. So we look for ways to consolidate ownership patterns, which makes it a little bit easier for us to manage. We also try to leverage management resources of other agencies and entities. And then finally, the lowest in priority is to meet a specific school and or community need. These include improving stability, providing growth opportunities, and improving access and recreational opportunities. Next slide. So how do we achieve our management objectives? This is a kind of a laundry list of all the things we do: grazing, easements, land sales and exchanges, renewables, mineral leasing. We have a trust land preservation and enhancement account that helps us mitigate some of the things that happen on state lands where people are dumping and other things like that. We have a tremendous records management program internally. But I will say that we're always searching for new opportunities for compatible uses on state trust lands. And in this day and age with the economy the way it is, we're looking to diversify our, our opportunities as much as possible. Next slide. So our trust land earnings, 86% of state trust lands are classified as common schools, and those support K through 12 education. 14% generate revenues to support those other institutions that are on the list. Grazing is the most prevalent use of state trust lands, which cover approximately 90% of our surface acreage, and we certainly rely on our grazing lessees to help us manage our surface acres. However, as you might imagine, mineral development has generated the most income for the state trust land beneficiaries over the years. Unfortunately, with some of the slowdown in the industry, we're definitely seeing impacts to our pocketbook on that. So next slide. One of the things that I always do when I talk about state lands is to emphasize, a lot of people get confused about, they think state trust lands are the same as public federal lands. And we're not the same as federal public lands. And we're not the same as BLM. You know, BLM and other federal agencies, they manage federal lands for multiple use and sustained yield. which means that they manage public lands for a variety of reasons, such as energy development, grazing, recreation, timber harvesting. While they're also looking to ensure cultural and historic resources are maintained for present and future use. Conversely, state trust lands are managed with consistent trust principles, long-term growth in value and optimum sustainable revenue production. We're mainly about revenue production to support K through 12 education and the other institutions for which we have responsibility. So with that, I'm going to briefly turn the presentation over to Deputy Crowder. He's going to talk briefly about weed and pest, and then I'm going to take it back quickly and talk about a program we have over the State Loan and Investment Board side. So Jason?
Thank you, ma'am. Mr. Chairman, the Weed and Pest Program is our response to the Weed and Pest Act. We're acting as a landowner within the state, and as such, we need to manage and attempt to control noxious weeds and pests pursuant to that act. In 2009, the board did create Chapter 28, the Weed and Pest Program, which is a cost share program with our lessees, where we participate in the control costs of various noxious weeds and pests across the state, and I'll get into that in just a little bit. But we also push a lot of that responsibility off onto our lessees, our grazing lessees, our special use lessees, easement holders, and mineral lessees. They all have a requirement that they also control noxious weeds and pests that may have popped up because of the uses on our lands, and then they can participate in our cost share program. It's important to note that our cost share program is a reimbursement to the county districts only, not to those state lessees. So they need to, all of our state lessees need to work with the county districts in order to be eligible for this funding. And that is intended to maybe create more of a landscape approach to noxious weed management through the districts. They understand what's needed on the ground and where money may be best applied. And of course, we prioritize our funding as it's changed over the years. Treatments for leafy spurge and special management programs receive the highest priorities. So into our cost share program, again, the cost share are broken down. Sorry.
Can you hear me? Hold up just a minute. We've got a question.
Sure.
Representative Larson.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. I got a question on the leasees. If they do not maintain control of the noxious weeds, is somebody out there, or pests, is somebody out monitoring this? And is there a reprimand of some sort where they lose the lease, or how do you control that, I guess, is my question.
Thank you. Great question, Mr. Chairman, Representative Larson. Yes, so we have the field staff that are scattered across the state, as the director mentioned. They are actively doing inspections and compliance inspections in all the leases and easements that we hold. There's a total of 6 of them, I believe, so they're a very busy group. And when they do come across an infestation, we note it. We provide that lessee with documentation, a letter indicating that there is a cost share program available to them, that they do have the responsibility for that control. And if they don't do anything towards control, they could lose their lease. That is a provision within their lease that they must comply with. And if they don't, we could approach the Board of Land Commissioners and have that lease terminated.
Follow up. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So how many times have you taken leases away on that sort of item?
Mr. Chairman, we haven't taken any leases away because of this. We found our documentation process, our working with the lessees and through the weed and pest districts, that to be very effective. So we've not needed to do that yet.
Okay. Thank you. Go ahead and continue, Mr. Chairman.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. So our cost share program is broken down like this. So we will reimburse up to the total cost for leafy spurge, for the special management programs, for any weed or pest that might fall into the category of early detection, rapid response species, and then of course for all of the vacant lands that don't have a lessee on them. We also provide a cost share of up to 50% of the application cost. This is for chemical and labor. For those very high cost species like Russian olive, salt cedar, and prairie dogs. Those are the ones that have the most detriment to revenue generation And so those are the ones that we really would like to incentivize lessees to control. And so we've created a 50% cost share application for those weeds. The remaining the remaining noxious weeds on the state designated list, we provide for chemical only. We expect that the lessee through the district to pay for all of the application measures for those weeds. Here is a list of our special management programs that we participate in across the state. And again, we cost share at 100% of the cost for work done on state trust lands. And then finally, I wanted to provide just a budget summary. This is a budget that's gone up and down over the last few years as budget cuts deemed necessary. So going back to fiscal or the biennium 7-8, we were appropriated $750,000 for this program and expended $563,000. And just going down the list, you can see how that's been reduced over time due to budget cuts to where we've hit the bottom in fiscal year 17-18 of $350,000. What's also important to note here was in fiscal year 19-20, through a governor's letter, the legislature appropriated us an additional one-time $500,000 to be used for noxious weed work. That's why the 19-20 budget was bumped up to $850,000. And you can notice that the use or the amount that we've expended directly is correlated to how much we're budgeted. So there is a need, and for every dollar that we're budgeted, we've seen great use of that. So we understand that there's a demand out there. However, we were forced in this latest budget cut to reduce our weed and pest budget down to zero. The governor made that effective the second half of the biennium, so we were functionally cut in half for this year. So we currently have $175,000 in this program for noxious weed and pest work. I also want to make mention that the legislature did appropriate us during the last session an additional $500,000 one-time again funding. However, they didn't put that in the weed and pest program. They put that in our trust preservation and enhancement account that the director mentioned earlier. It goes to largely the same weeds that we're talking about here. However, it can also be used for additional weeds that aren't on the state identified noxious weed and pest list. That's why.
Thanks, Jason. So continuing on, we're gonna sort of switch over now to, oh, I'm sorry.
Hang on a minute, we've got.
Okay.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. This fires me up, I guess. I just don't know how the state can think that they shouldn't take care of their lands. It's like a landowner having a house and not taking care of it. And so where does this committee or representatives need to go? Do we need to go to the board and state our case, or is this fight only in the legislature?
Mr. Chairman, I'll attempt to answer that question. So it is a board rule that allows the cost share program to be in place. The board approves all the leases, easements, and permits that have the requirement to control noxious weeds placed on those users. So it's board directive or board policy that kind of guides us to where we are today. And I suppose we can reach out to the board and have the discussion about additional funding, and then our additional control over those weeds at our level. And then, of course, we'd have to go to the legislature for additional appropriation.
Okay, we've got another question here, Senator Boner.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Crowder, for that presentation on this weed and pest element of your mission at state lands. I'm just wondering how much staff time is dedicated to administering this program, where, if I understand it correctly, first of all, let me back up. It's the local county districts that make requests to state lands, and you have to make a decision which ones you approve and which ones you don't. And I'm just wondering, first of all, if that's correct, and second of all, how much staff time is dedicated to administering that program.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. That's another really good question, and we haven't quantified the amount of time it takes to run this program. All of our field staff and several internal office staff here participate in the management of this program. I don't know if I could even guess how much time it would take. It is at times a very cumbersome process, especially as we're going through the requests from the district, and then a very cumbersome process as we're working with our lessees who may need a little additional incentive to control those weeds and pests on the lands that they lease. But we can provide an estimate for you, and we can go back and check with our staff to see how much time they spend.
Yeah, I imagine we'd be following up with that one.
Continue.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chairman. So now we'll switch to the other side of the organizational chart, and we'll just talk briefly about the State Loan and Investment Board. Wyoming Statute 1134-102 provides that the Board of Land Commissioners is constituted as the State Loan and Investment Board. So they put on their other hats, the 5 electeds. The director is the Chief Executive Officer, and the deputy is the Deputy Chief Executive Officer. The SLIB manages various grant loan programs for the state of Wyoming. And as I mentioned, I think previously, a lot of it has to do with cities, counties, towns, and special districts related to financing, capital construction, and other infrastructure projects. Next slide, please. However, we do have one program that's applicable to the agricultural community. It's the Farm Loan Program. This program was established in 1921. It provides long-term loans to Wyoming's agricultural operators. Currently, the program is supported by $275 million from the Permanent Mineral Trust Fund. 220 of that is to fund farm loans themselves. 55 million is for beginning agriculture producer loans. Historically, this fund is considered a safety net for ag borrowing. The interest rate is 8%. That's why that's a little bit high for regular farm loans. For beginning ag producers, the interest rate is, for the first 10 years, it's the lower of 8%, or the average yield on a 10-year US Treasury bond the year before the loan closes. And then at the end of the 10 years, it adjusts up to 8%, the idea being to help move people up and out of the program. Again, the idea is not to compete with bank loans. This is kind of a loan of last resort, kind of the safety net idea. Next slide, please. So the Farm Loan Program, the loans are generally made for purchasing lands used for raising ag products, livestock, or dairying, purchasing livestock fertilizers and equipment calculated to maintain or increase earning capacity of the borrower's ag operations, to purchase, construct, or install improvements to increase earning capacity of the borrower's agricultural operations, or to liquidate debts of the borrower incurred in furtherance of the borrower's agricultural operations. And so that's just kind of a high-level overview. I didn't want to get too far into the weeds on that. And I think that concludes our presentation. If there are any questions, we would stand for those at this time.
Committee question.
Yes, Mr. Chairman.
Larson.
Who sets up the interest rate? I mean, 8% is just outrageous.
Mr. Chairman, I believe that the interest rate is set by statute. And again, the idea was for the loan program not to compete with banks and lending institutions. It's sort of thought to be a separate safety net. If you can't get a bank loan, then this is where you go.
Mr.
Follow
Chairman, thank you. If it's a last resort, by 8%, they're already done. They need to have a last resort at a cheaper rate and figure out how we encourage them to go to the banks first. But I farmed, and you don't make it very easy. But people I think farming is very important. We need to figure out how we can make it work.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just, I want to make sure I understand this. I guess taking back off Representative Larson, is that 8% you said it's set in statute? Is that federal statute or state statute? And does this have any relation to the federal, Farm Services Agency? I think they have an office in Casper, for example, where they offer these sorts of loans to, say, beginning producers. Is this a completely separate program, or is this in conjunction with that federal program?
Mr. Chairman, to my knowledge, this is not affiliated with the federal program. This is set in state statute.
Representative Blackburn, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Can you tell us what statute that is, please?
Excuse me, Mr. Chairman. Let me see if I can find it.
Mr. Chairman, I believe that statute 1134, 202. Let me make sure that's correct. It would be in Title 11, Section 34, roughly, if that's not it.
Mr. Chairman, we'd be happy to drill down into that, to provide that to the committee.
All right, Representative Larson.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. I think I'm ready to make a motion that this committee bring this topic up and that the LSO work with your office and figure out what we need to do. I don't know if that's enough to bring a concept or not, but I'm going to make that motion.
Okay. Motion to go ahead.
Yeah, so Mr. Chairman, perhaps we could, I mean, because I'm just looking at that statute for the first time myself, perhaps we could, we're going to continue this subject after lunch, perhaps after we hear from all the other agencies, public testimony. That's a good thought. Maybe hold on to it. I agree with you. That's something we can do, but I need more time to think about it a little bit, provide staff better direction. Yeah, I think we're on something represent, but maybe just give us like an hour.
Yeah. They'll be back up right after we finish lunch. So does that sound good to the State Land Board? We'll have further discussion.
Yes, Mr. Chairman.
So I believe we are no further questions. We're going to be real limited on time because we have some people that are scheduled at 1:30. Come on up. Start that. And the business council. Would you be okay with continuing this right after lunch? In fact, I can think of some ways it might be better because we're going to have a discussion during lunch too.
Yeah, and Mr. Chairman, I don't have anything else to present. I think both of those topics are that the topic was covered in my first presentation. So if there are any questions, we could stand for those now. Of course, we'd be happy to return after lunch if that's the case or if that's needed. Not just in the interest of time, but I don't have anything else to present.
Okay, I don't see any further questions for the business council, but you'll be around for a little bit afterwards, won't you? After lunch.
Yes,
Go
sir.
ahead.
Yes, thank
Senator
you.
Boner.
Yeah, so Mr. Chairman, the thing is that, we have to be back at 1:30 because we have some of our board of land commissioners, the governor and the treasurer will be here. So the committee and everybody, we're going to have to kind of skip on to topic number 6 briefly. And then we'll come back to this after we get done with that. Actually, that's a pretty good stopping point because we'll still be focused on state lands. But yeah, we got an hour for lunch. Have to be back at 1:30. That's when 2 of our 5 statewide elected officials will be with us. And there's a Subway just up the street. Not saying where to go, but there's something quick. Yeah. Oh, and and there's a cafe right there. So okay. All right. So yeah.
All right. We'll break for lunch and fire up at 1:30.